We at Cracku provide all the previous year CAT papers along with many other MBA examinations such as XAT, SNAP, MAT, CMAT, TIS and PGDBA in the actual exam format. You can attempt them as a test and get a detailed analysis of your performance or download them as PDFs.
Hello and welcome to another video by Cracku. A passage has been given below. Let us read it carefully and answer the questions that follow. So this is a CAT 2023 RC. Let us dive right in. The positivists, anxious to stake out their claim for history as a science, contributed the weight of their influence to the cult of facts. First, ascertain the facts, said the positivists, then draw your conclusions from them. This is what may be called the common sense view of history. History consists of a corpus of ascertained facts. The facts are available to the historian in documents, inscriptions, and so on. Sir George Clarke contrasted the hardcore of facts in history with the surrounding pulp of disputable interpretation, forgetting perhaps that the pulpy part of the fruit is more rewarding than the hardcore. It recalls the favorite dictum of the great liberal journalist C.P. Scott, facts are sacred, opinion is free. So here in this first paragraph, I note two distinct points. Firstly, the author is using the example of positivists to establish an idea. This idea is how history itself is determined by facts or factual accuracy. This is at the core of this first paragraph, and then the author is counteracting this point. He's presenting his disagreement with this stated idea. He's trying to say that perhaps the interpretive aspect rather than, let's say, factual accuracy is what takes precedence. So this is the opinion according to him. How did we come to this particular idea? So firstly, in this part here at the beginning, the author says that positivists, they wanted to emphasize that history is basically a science. And why is it a science? They first want to establish the facts and then they want to draw conclusions. So in a way, positivists are presenting this particular idea of how factual accuracy is definitely significant. The author calls this as the common sense view of history. In the common sense view of history, we are giving more emphasis, or we are placing more emphasis on facts. So facts need to be correct. Only after you have established the facts can you draw conclusions or make interpretations perhaps. The author also states this idea by Sir George Clarke, who is trying to contrast two different aspects. So aspect number one here is the hardcore of facts. Aspect number two here is the pulp of disputable interpretation. What does both these ideas indicate? So firstly, the hardcore of facts is basically highlighting how facts might be the center of history or any kind of historical study. Secondly, the pulp of disputable interpretation. Here he's trying to say that factual accuracy is perhaps more significant than interpretation. But the author says that when Mr. Clarke here is, or when Sir Clarke here is making this particular contrast, he's forgetting that the pulpy part of the fruit is more rewarding than the hardcore. So in a way, the author is trying to say that perhaps interpretation is more significant than establishing the factual accuracy itself. This might be the line of thought that the author possesses. He might not have explicitly stated this here in the first paragraph, but we can see, or we can note, that the author does not agree with this idea of facts being at the center of any kind of historical study, or facts being given more emphasis than, let's say, interpretation. He also cites this idea by journalist C.P. Scott, who says that facts are sacred, opinion is free. This again aligns with this idea mentioned earlier on, how facts are very much significant. And this particular claim here, or this particular quote here, is aligning with the common sense view of history, which is placing facts at the center, which is giving more significance to facts compared to, let's say, opinions. So this is the point here. Again, opinion and fact, it's trying to present this idea of something that is much more objective to, let's say, something that is subjective. So this subjective versus objective appears to be at the core of this first paragraph, and the author is taking the side of the subjective aspects. He's saying that interpretation might be perhaps more significant than, let's say, establishing facts themselves. So this is the first paragraph. I hope that the idea here is clear. Let's move on to the next part of the discussion and see how the author is extending on his thought. What is a historical fact? According to the common sense view, there are certain basic facts which are the same for all historians and which form, so to speak, the backbone of history. The fact, for example, that the Battle of Hastings was fought in 1066. But this view calls for two observations. In the first place, it is not with facts like these that that the historian is primarily concerned. It is no doubt important to know that the great battle was fought in 1066 and not in 1065 or 1067, and that it was fought at Hastings and not Eastbourne or Brighton. The historian must not get these things wrong. But to praise a historian for his accuracy is like praising an architect for using well-seasoned timber or properly mixed concrete in his building. It is a necessary condition of his work, but not his essential function. It is precisely for matters of this kind that the historian is entitled to rely on what have been called the auxiliary sciences of history: archaeology, epigraphy, numismatics, chronology, and so forth. So here the author is building his case. He is trying to present the idea that this entire point or this entire statement around the significance of facts might be misplaced. He's trying to communicate this via certain observations here. So firstly, in this paragraph, he's trying to discuss the nature of facts itself. He's trying to first define what would qualify as an historical fact according to the common sense view. And then he's trying to say that, okay, I can observe certain discrepancies here. Let me note down those observations. The first observation he's presenting is with regard to how a historian is not necessarily concerned or not primarily concerned with establishing the accuracy of facts. So he says that the factual accuracy is not something that can be considered as the essence of a historian's work. So a historian's work is perhaps something totally different. So in a way, the author is trying to indicate that that the accuracy of historical facts is not what a historian needs to be too much worried about. He says that that's something that is an essential condition. It's something that is already necessary. It's not something that can be considered as a contribution made by the historian himself. So in a way, he might be implying that perhaps the interpretation of these facts might be what makes a historian a historian. So this is what he's perhaps trying to convey to the readers, not again explicitly stated, but he's just trying to say that this entire point around facts might be a bit misplaced, because establishing the accuracy of facts is not something that can be considered as the primary function of a historian's job. This is what the author is trying to say. He says that it's for this very same reason, to establish the accuracy of a fact, we have something called as auxiliary sciences, and he says that this would be archaeology, this would be numismatics, epigraphy, chronology. So all of this would help us to establish the accuracy of a fact. You cannot say that a historian needs to be primarily concerned with establishing the accuracy of a fact. And he says that to praise a historian for his accuracy in terms of the facts that he's presenting in his work would be equivalent to praising an architect for using well-seasoned timber. So in a way, the author is saying that it is automatically expected of an architect to use good quality material while building something or while constructing something. You cannot say that, okay, oh, he's an architect, so his primary job is to establish or to make sure that the materials used are of the best quality. No, that is automatically expected of him. Perhaps the design, the kind of design that the architect comes up with is what gives value to his work. So similarly, perhaps the kind of interpretation that a historian presents of a set of facts that he has is perhaps what adds value to his work. This is the idea the author might be trying to convey here, and this appears to be the first observation here in the passage. So he says that firstly, we need to identify what would qualify as a fact according to the to this common sense view. So he says that, for example, common sense view, we know that the Battle of Hastings took place in so and so year, and this might be quite an important piece of information, but by its own, this is not what the author or this is not what the historian is supposed to be concerned about. The historian is not necessarily worried about, let's say, establishing that, okay, the Battle of Hastings took place in so and so here. This is something that is automatically expected of him, that he is, let's say, checking archaeological records to establish that this was the particular year. Now, why did the Battle of Hastings take place in this particular year might be what would be more significant or what would actually add value to the work of a historian. This is what the author is trying to perhaps convey here. And how are we making this particular how are we making this particular claim here? We are making this claim based on what we understood in the first paragraph. The author says that there is this common sense view of history which he doesn't agree with. So his disagreement is something that we gleaned in the very first paragraph, and now whatever interpretations we are making is based on that particular understanding of ours. So I hope this paragraph as well is clear. It appears a bit complicated in terms of what the author is trying to discuss, but our agenda here is to identify that this is what the author intends to convey. This is his position so far, and this is the information he's trying to present. So in terms of the information he's presenting these information to establish his own claim. He's trying to make a point. He's trying to say that purely focusing on facts might be counterintuitive, especially in the context of, let's say, the kind of work that a historian undertakes. This is what the author is primarily concerned with here in the passage. So I hope this idea is very much clear. We are just trying to see what kind of arguments the author himself is presenting to sort of support this idea he presents at the very beginning of the passage. Let's move on to the next part of the discussion. The second observation is that the necessity to establish these basic facts rests not on any quality in the facts themselves, but on an a priori decision of the historian. In spite of C.P. Scott's motto, every journalist knows today that the most effective way to influence opinion is by selection and arrangement of the appropriate facts. It used to be said that the facts speak for themselves. This is, of course, untrue. The facts speak only when the historian calls on them. It is he who decides to which facts to give the floor and in what order or context. The only reason why we are interested to know that the battle was fought at Hastings in 1066 is that the historians regard it as a major historical event. Professor Talcott Parsons once called science a selective system of cognitive orientations to reality. It might perhaps have been put more simply, but history is, among other things, that the historian is necessarily selective. The belief in a hard core of historical facts existing objectively and independently of the interpretation of the historian is a preposterous fallacy, but one which is very hard to eradicate. So we get this clear-cut claim that the author is presenting at the very end of the passage. So far we have been just making certain interpretations based on the kind of attitude we saw in the first paragraph that the author had. But now here the author is making a very clear-cut claim. He's saying that the very idea that facts exist objectively and independently outside the interpretation of a historian is completely fallacious. It's completely flawed. It's not something that we can agree, or that the author at least agrees with. And he says that it's very difficult to eradicate in itself. So he's saying that this fallacy or this misbelief is something that persists or continues to, let's say, pervade the historical the community of historians. And in a way, he's trying to emphasize that facts themselves are chosen not based on their inherent quality. So this is the second observation that he's presenting, and together with the first observation, he's trying to make this idea very clear that facts do not exist objectively. The way in which these facts are presented also influences certain things. In this case, it's influencing opinions of people. So the author says that you cannot say that the facts speak for themselves. The facts themselves are perhaps not of very much use, and it's only after the historian has arranged or presented the facts in a certain manner that you can come up with a particular idea, or you can establish something. So this is the point that the author is trying to make here. So in this first part here, when the author mentions the second observation, he's trying to say that we do not choose facts based on their inherent quality. So it's not because they have some kind of quality, or they have some kind of inherent value in themselves, which is why we are choosing them. The author is saying that it's based on the decision of the historian. So there might be, let's say, fact A, B and C, and the historian might choose to just present, let's say, fact A. And that choice, that particular choice, is definitely going to influence the kind of opinion that we have. And this is where the author again invokes C.P. Scott. So earlier on, he talks about how C.P. Scott, who is a journalist, says that facts are sacred and opinions are free. And in this regard, we might have interpreted it as, let's say, facts being very important and opinions being, let's say, less important. But that's not the case. The author is saying that opinion is very much dependent on the way in which we are presenting the facts, in a way in which the historian is presenting facts. So this is the point that is being presented here. Again, the author's intention here is to showcase that facts do not exist objectively, or it's not independent of the historian and his, let's say, selective bias. That's not the case. It's dependent on the historian and the way in which the historian chooses to present the fact. So that's what eventually infuses or gets translated into an opinion. So he's trying to say here that this entire logic of, let's say, saying that facts are very important, or facts is at the center of history, is perhaps not of much value to the author himself. He's saying that this common sense view of history might not be making much sense to him. So in a way, when he says earlier that the pulp of interpretation is what might be more rewarding, he might be trying to say that the interpretive nature of history is what he values, rather than, let's say, compared to this this perspective wherein we are purely dependent on facts and we are considering facts to be objective. When he says that facts themselves are not objective, they are based on the kind of bias or the kind of selection that historians undertake. So this is the point that the author is trying to make here. Altogether, this appears to be a criticism of a particular viewpoint that the author is undertaking. He's presenting certain observations to make his point. So I hope the discussion so far is clear. We notice that in the very first paragraph, the author mentions the positivist to establish an idea, to establish the common sense view of history, which is based on facts. The author says, or he presents his position subtly by saying that he disagrees with this idea, and then he goes on to explore the nature of facts itself. And while exploring the nature of facts, he draws two observations. The first observation is how the historian's job is not to establish the accuracy of facts, it is automatically expected of him. The second observation is how facts are not chosen based on their innate quality, but based on the historian's preference. And this selective nature of work that historians undertake is exactly what makes historical facts less objective or less independent of the historian itself. So this is the point the author is trying to make. He makes this statement very clearly towards the end of the passage, and it's only after we have read the entire discussion that we understand that the author is trying to make a point. He's trying to criticize a particular position. Now that we have understood what this discussion is about, let us move on to the questions and try answering them. According to the passage, which one of the following statements best describes the significance of archaeology for historians? So the author labels archaeology as an auxiliary science, and he says that we use such auxiliary sciences to establish the accuracy of some kind of historical fact that is being presented. Let us check which of the options aligns with this. A. Archaeology helps historians to locate the oldest civilizations in history. We know that this is totally irrelevant to the discussion, so we can easily eliminate A. B. Archaeology helps historians to ascertain factual accuracy, something that we can understand based on the discussion that we have seen. C. Archaeology helps historians to carry out their primary duty, not something that is implied. The author says that such auxiliary sciences might aid their work, but to carry out their primary duty, this primary duty is not specifically clarified, but we can perhaps understand that the primary duty might be along the lines of interpreting or coming up with the interpretation of certain historical events. That could be what the author might qualify as the primary duty, but again, there is no explicit mention that archaeology helps historians carry out their primary duty. So this is also totally off topic. D. Archaeology helps historians to interpret historical facts. Again, this is not exactly what the author is trying to convey when he talks about archaeology. The significance here is that such auxiliary sciences help us establish factual accuracy. So this is what the author intends to convey when he mentions these auxiliary sciences. So option B correctly captures that. We can easily eliminate all the other choices once we come across option B. So option D is also incorrect. Let's move on to the next question. Question number 2. All of the following, if true, can weaken the passage's claim that facts do not speak for themselves, except. So what would actually align with the idea that facts are not objective? So this is what this particular question is trying to test. So we are told that all of the following will actually weaken the claim that facts do not speak for themselves. This is the position that the author himself presents. He says that facts do not speak for themselves, they are not objective, they are not independent of the historian's interpretation. This is what he's trying to present. So which of the following, if true, would actually align with this? This is what this question is trying to test. Let's check. A. The truth value of a fact is independent of the historian who expresses it. So if this is true, this is actually weakening this claim. So we can eliminate option A because it is in fact actually weakening, and we have to find something that does not weaken this particular idea. So A is incorrect. B. A fact by its very nature is objective and universal, irrespective of the context in which it is placed. Again, this is contrary to this particular statement here that facts do not speak for themselves. So in a way, it's actually weakening this claim here. So when we say that facts are actually objective, we are going against the point that the author has presented here. So option B is also weakening this particular claim that is being stated here in the question. We can eliminate option B. C. Facts like truth can be relative. What is fact for person X may not be so for person Y. So this is aligning with this particular idea here. When we say that facts do not speak for themselves, we can in fact say that facts are relative. So what might be a fact for person, let's say X, might not be a fact for person Y. So in this way, we are indicating that facts are actually not objective. So when we say that it's not objective, this, if true, would actually align with this claim here that the author is making when he says that facts are not independent. So option C here is the correct answer, likely to be the correct answer to this question here. D. The order in which a series of facts is presented does not have any bearing on the production of meaning. So this is again going against what the author presents towards the end of the passage. He says that the order in which a historian selects and presents facts is definitely going to influence opinion. So when we say that that's not the case here, it's actually weakening the claim that is being stated in the passage. So we can eliminate option D as well. Among the given choices, we notice that only option C aligns with the given claim here. So whenever we come across such double negatives, it is essential for us to identify what the question is trying to ask here. When we are told that all of the following can weaken the passage's claim except, so we have to find something that does not weaken the passage's claim, and this claim here is that facts do not speak for themselves. So we have to find something among the choices that is aligning with this particular claim, or that is something that is going to strengthen or add value or add support to this particular statement here. So only option C does that, and hence it is the correct choice. Let's move on to the next question. Question number 3. If the author of the passage were to write a book on the Battle of Hastings along the lines of his or her own reasoning, the focus of the historical account would be on. So firstly, this question tests us on the attitude or the kind of intention that the author had while writing this particular piece. So it helps us gain some insight into the author's own reasoning. So what could be his reasoning? We know for sure that the author is someone who, let's say, supports interpretation over factual accuracy. So he's not a big fan of factual accuracy. He's someone who is not a big fan of the hardcore of facts. He's someone who is more interested in the pulp of disputable interpretation. That is something that we can understand based on the discussion. So it has to be something that might perhaps, let's say, explore why this particular battle took place, what led to this particular battle, what are some of the subjective aspects associated with this historical event. This is something that the author would most likely explore, as opposed to, let's say, just presenting a sort of list of facts attached to this event here. So this is a understanding that we have of the author, and based on this understanding, let us try to assess the given choices. A. Exploring the socio-political and economic factors that led to the battle. This is something that the author is likely to do, primarily because it might contain certain interpretive aspects rather than, let's say, just factual elements. So option A is something that fits the bill here, something that definitely aligns with the author's reasoning. We'll put it on hold for now. Let us examine the other choices. B. Producing a detailed timeline of various events that led to the battle. Again, this is something that we could qualify as purely factual, or something that would involve using just facts, a list of facts perhaps. So establishing a timeline doesn't involve any interpretive elements here. So option B is something that we can reject. So basically this question is assessing us to figure out what would involve fact versus what would involve interpretation, and we can easily eliminate choices that are just purely, let's say, along the lines of factual information. C. Deriving historical facts from the relevant documents and inscriptions. Again, we know this is definitely not something that the author might be interested about, because he is again going against or talking about how facts are not necessarily the center of any kind of historical discussion. So not necessarily that it's not at the center of historical discussion, but he's just trying to say that this entire view of placing facts on the pedestal is not something that he agrees with. So option C and D are both purely focusing on facts. So the author might not be too interested in presenting a historical account along these lines. D. Providing a nuanced interpretation by relying on auxiliary sciences. This is also not something that is far off from what is being discussed here. The author might be interested in presenting a nuanced interpretation, but this mention of auxiliary sciences here is a bit odd. Again, why do we use auxiliary sciences? It's to establish the accuracy of facts. So perhaps we could say that this interpretation is largely dependent on, let's say, establishing the accuracy of facts, which again the author might not be very happy about. So if I had to make a choice between A and D, A is a much more better choice, primarily because it doesn't involve this term here on auxiliary sciences, and it is much more clear that that A involves interpretation. Whether or not the interpretation in D is something that the author might be interested in is unclear to us. So we could say that between A and D, A is definitely the better choice. Let us move on to the next question. Question number 4. All of the following describe the common sense view of history except. So we have to find a choice that does not describe or does not align with this common sense view of history. Let us inspect the choices. A. Real history can be found in ancient engravings and archival documents. We know that common sense view of history is very much for establishing historical facts. So in a way, they say that these are facts that are actually available to historian documents, inscriptions, and so on. So option A is something that we can eliminate, mainly because it describes the common sense view of history, or it might align with this particular view of history. B, only the positivist methods can lead to credible historical knowledge is also something that we could link with this common sense view of history, although it appears to be a bit ambiguous. But since this is a previous year question, one way to rationalize this is what the author is trying to do when he talks about how positivists are emphasizing history as a science. So by this, they are trying to say that we first establish the facts and then we draw conclusions, and they feel that this is the correct way to do history, or to sort of explore history. So option B is actually trying to convey that particular idea, and in this regard, again, it aligns, or it can be linked with this common sense view of history. So we can eliminate option B as well. C, history is like science, a selective system of cognitive orientations to reality. Now this first half here is definitely true. This is something that we observe in the beginning itself, but the second half, where this is something that I think Mr. Parsons here had mentioned, but what the author is trying to do when he mentions this particular quote here is to emphasize how how the selection of facts takes place, and how facts themselves are not objective. So in a way, both these points here are contradictory. So what is being stated here is basically showcasing how science itself is selective in nature. We are having selective interpretations of, let's say, reality, and the author is trying to emphasize that in this regard, you can say that history is definitely like science. But again, this is not aligning with the common sense view of history, because in common sense view of history, we are saying that history is like science because first we are establishing facts. Facts according to the common sense view of history is objective, and then based on this, then we are drawing conclusions. So both these points in C are actually contrary to the common sense view of history. This first part might somewhat align with the common sense view of history, but the second part, the interpretation, or this analogy between history and science is sort of telling us that it's not the common sense view of history, or it's against the common sense view of history. So option C here is the correct answer. D, history can be objective like the sciences if it is derived from historical facts. This is true. This is what is being presented here with regard to the common sense view of history. So we can eliminate option D as well. Among the given statements, we notice that A, B, and D align with the common sense view of history, while option C is not something that we could say can be used to describe this particular view or perspective of history. So option C here is the correct answer. Thank you. Hello and welcome to another video by Cracku. A passage is given below. Let us read it carefully and answer the questions that follow. This is a CAT 2023 RC. Let us dive right into the first paragraph. Umberto Eco, an Italian writer, was right when he said, "The language of Europe is translation. Netflix and other deep-pocketed global firms speak it well. Just as the EU employs a small army of translators and interpreters to turn intricate laws or impassioned speeches of Romanian MEPs into the EU's 24 official languages, so do the likes of Netflix. It now offers dubbing in 34 languages and subtitling in a few more." So in this first paragraph, the author is discussing the role of translation, drawing parallels between the platforms of Netflix and how there are multilingual operations of the EU in terms of how they are translating certain speeches or content that takes place during any kind of EP discussions or European Parliament discussions. More specifically, the author is trying to talk about the impact of Netflix, how Netflix is employing individuals in to undertake translation services, and this is then further emphasized by how they offer dubbing and subtitling services in more than 34 languages. So altogether, what the author is trying to do here in the first paragraph is trying to talk about the role of translation in the global success of streaming platforms, perhaps. This is the intention here. What the author intends to convey is this extensive use of dubbing and subtitling in various languages that is undertaken by Netflix. That appears to be the center of the discussion here. Let us see how that's relevant to the overall theme. The economics of European productions are more appealing to. American audiences are more willing than before to give dubbed or subtitled viewing a chance. This means shows such as Lupin, a French crime caper, on Netflix can become global hits. In 2015, about 75% of Netflix's original content was American. Now the figure is half, according to Ampere, a media analysis company. Netflix has about 100 productions underway in Europe, which is more than the public broadcasters in France or Germany. So in this paragraph, the author emphasizes the economic appeal of European productions, with American audiences increasingly viewing dubbed or subtitled programs. So altogether, what the author wants to convey here is that this entire aspect of translation that we came across in the first paragraph might be primarily driven or fueled by this economics here in terms of the productions and the programs that are broadcasted. The author says that American audiences are in a way showcasing more demand and more inclination towards these dubbed or subtitled programs. So he's basically saying that European programs, which were perhaps not in much demand earlier on, are now in demand. This is the idea he wants to convey, and he is presenting certain evidence in this regard to support this particular idea that there is more demand now more than ever for these European shows, for these European productions. He gives us statistics here. He says that in 2015, 75% of the shows that were produced were American. Now that has become half, in a way indicating that the remaining half perhaps has some kind of global appeal. It is not purely American and caters to a wider audience. This is what the author intends to convey via this statistics or this data point presented here. He also highlights how this appeal might translate to European productions being more popular. So shows such as Lupin, the author says that this is a French show. This might become a global hit primarily because American audiences now find such shows appealing, and this appeal is in a way driven by the translation services, the subtitling, the dubbing of these productions that we came across in the first paragraph. So this is how the author is linking these two different texts. In the first paragraph, he talks about how translation plays a significant role in terms of the success that we observe for streaming platforms like Netflix. He says that they deploy or they employ a large group of translators perhaps to subtitle and dub their content. And this in turn is fueled or driven by the interest shown by American audiences. So the author is giving us this complete picture here in the first two paragraphs. Let us read further and see how the next segment of the discussion is relevant. Not everything works across borders. Comedy sometimes struggles. Whodunits and bloodthirsty maelstroms between arch Romans and uppity tribesmen have a more universal appeal. Some do it better than others. Barbarians aside, German television is not always built for export, says one executive, being polite. A bigger problem is that national broadcasters still dominate. Streaming services such as Netflix or Disney Plus account for about a third of all viewing hours, even in markets where they are well established. Europe is an aging continent. The generation of teens staring at phones is outnumbered by their elders who prefer to gawp at the box. So in this paragraph, the author presents certain constraints associated with this streaming success that we have observed of platforms, certain platforms. Here the author says that not everything works across borders. So not all kind of programs have the same appeal. He says that some set of programs or some genre of programs might work, others might not. So comedy is one such example, which the author says often struggles, and perhaps primarily because it could be that comedy is often localized in a certain sense. Some of the jokes that might be relevant, let's say in one country, might not be relevant in another country, or might not be understood well in another country despite proper translation. So in a way, the author says that this particular genre of comedy struggles. It doesn't work well across borders, while certain other genres such as whodunits, which are mystery or thrillers, and any kind of shows that showcase some form of conflict, they often perform better. So the author says that there are certain genres that work, others that don't. The author also here tells how executives in these media houses or that are part of these streaming services often feel that German television might also not work properly across borders. So that's another opinion that is being presented. So this first half is discussing certain constraints associated with streaming platforms like Netflix, more specifically how they might face certain hurdles, how certain genres might work, others might not. The second half of this particular paragraph is presenting another issue, how media houses or how national broadcasters are still in a way leading the game. So the author says that a large chunk of the market share is still held by these national broadcasters. So, and this is the case in which this is the case even in geographies where Netflix or Disney Plus or such streaming platforms are well established. So the author says that it's not as if it's the case in some small niche region. That's not the case. Even in well-established markets where these streaming platforms are popular, even in such markets, the national broadcasters still dominate. We are given another statistics here, wherein the author says that a third of all viewing hours is still held by these national broadcasters. So they are the ones who are benefiting. And in a way, the author justifies that this could be primarily because the European population is aging. So that information is presented here, and more info is presented, wherein the author says that the number of old people, they outnumber the young ones, who generally tend to prefer streaming platforms and prefer to watch it in their phones perhaps. Altogether, what the author is trying to showcase here via this paragraph is certain constraints associated with the growth or the proliferation of these streaming platforms, like Netflix more specifically. So the author says that in the first paragraphs that there is definitely an increase in demand that we have observed because of, let's say, XYZ reasons, but there are also certain limitations, and he's listing these limitations here. Firstly, he says that only certain kinds of genres might work. Not all genres have an equal appeal. Second, he says that national broadcasters continue to dominate the market. So streaming platforms might have to find a way to crack the market and to perhaps cater to the larger audiences. And in a way, this might be difficult primarily because of the aging population in Europe. This is the information being provided to us so far. Let us read further. In Brussels and national capitals, the prospect of Netflix as a cultural hegemon is seen as a threat. Cultural sovereignty is the watchword of European executives, worried that Americans will eat their lunch. To be fair, Netflix content sometimes seems stuck in an uncanny valley somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, with local quirks stripped out. Netflix originals tend to have fewer specific cultural references than shows produced by domestic rivals, according to Enders, a market analyst. The company used to have an imperial model of commissioning, with executives in Los Angeles cooking up ideas French people might like. Now, Netflix has offices across Europe, but ultimately the big decisions rest with American executives. This makes European politicians nervous. So another issue associated with the streaming platforms is presented here. More specifically, the kind of cultural impact that Europeans perceive such streaming platforms might have. So the author says that cultural hegemon. So by this, he's trying to say that viewing Netflix as a cultural leader, having some form of cultural impact, is sort of threatening for many of these European executives, for many of the European politicians. In the case of executives, they are worried that the increasing popularity of Netflix would eat into their profits. So that's one of the worries that they have. As for the politicians, they might be worried primarily because they feel that there is a loss in the cultural values that is often portrayed in many of the Netflix programs. And the author says that it is in a way fair. It's a fair kind of tension that exists here, primarily because the content that Netflix churns out might not align well with the cultural values in many of these European regions. And he's giving us the reason behind this as well. Why is that the case? So this is primarily because the decisions that at the top level is often made by executives who are sitting in, let's say, US, and they might not have a well-rounded understanding of what's appealing or what aligns with the values of, let's say, certain European regions. And in this regard, because of this detachment, this sort of alienated way of making decisions in terms of the content that is being produced, the author says that it's definitely a worthwhile worry for many of these politicians, because the content that is churned out is definitely detached from what might be actually taking place in Europe. So in a way, the author is trying to say that there is a form of decentralization that has taken place, wherein the decisions with regard to content that needs to be, let's say, presented in Europe is being taken in the US. So that might not work well. Perhaps the author is intending to say that European audiences or European individuals should be deciding what kind of content needs to be produced within Europe and produced and spread in Europe. So that is what the author is trying to imply in a way, that there needs to be this dismantling of the existing structure in terms of what kind of content is being produced and what would appeal to the audiences. So this is the idea that is being implied here. Altogether, the purpose of this particular paragraph is to showcase another issue or another limitation associated with this proliferation of streaming platforms. The author has already presented us with two issues. One with regard to how many national broadcasters continue to dominate the market, and how certain genres might be less appealing than others, and how there has to be this decision or perhaps this dichotomy that might exist of choosing between, let's say, one particular genre and the other. So these are two problems that were mentioned in the earlier paragraph, and now the author is presenting another issue, that there is this perceived cultural threat around these streaming platforms. The author also presents the reasoning behind it. Why would that be the case? What could be leading to this particular perceived threat? That is also being discussed here in this paragraph here. I hope that aspect is clear. Let us move on to the next part. They should not be. So this is with reference to the fears of the European politicians. The author says that they should not be afraid. So why is it the case? Let's read further. An irony of European integration is that it is often American companies that facilitate it. Google Translate makes European newspapers comprehensible, even if a little clunky, for the continent's non-polyglots. American social media companies make it easier for Europeans to talk politics across borders. That they do not always like to hear what they say about each other is another matter. Now, Netflix and Friends pump the same content into homes across a continent, making culture a cross-border endeavor too. If Europeans are to share a currency, bail each other out in times of financial need, and share vaccines in a pandemic, then they need to have something in common, even if it's just binging on the same series. Watching fictitious Northern and Southern Europeans tear each other apart 2000 years ago beats doing so in reality. So for one, we identify that one of the objectives why the author is undertaking this discussion is to showcase how these streaming platforms such as Netflix serve a purpose. And in this case, according to him, what kind of problem might it be resolving? The author is trying to say that in a way, it furthers cultural unity amongst the people. So the author says that there is definitely a diverse set of opinions and voices that might exist, but such streaming platforms might enable people to understand other cultures better within the same region, and this in a way might help unite these different regions. This is what the author is trying to imply here via this last part of the discussion. Earlier on, the author says that European politicians should not be nervous. Why is it the case? For one, he says that European integration, so the unity that we observe in Europe, is in a way supported or facilitated by American companies. So American companies are in a way responsible for furthering European integration or European unity. And how is that the case? The author says that, for example, Google Translate helps people to translate the opinions and content and allows it to be spread across Europe. So people who are perhaps not able to speak languages of their immediate neighbors might be able to still understand the opinions and viewpoints that are shared on social media. Similarly, social media platforms also enables people to have open discussions, and this also is integral part of having some form of integration or unity. So in a way, the author says that these companies are inherently American, and in this regard, it's ironic in a way. So these European politicians should not be worried about, let's say, such American streaming platforms having a negative impact on their culture, primarily because a lot of the cultural unity that they see now in Europe has been enabled by American companies. So this is the irony here that the author wants to emphasize. But more specifically, the author is trying to say that these streaming platforms such as Netflix have the potential to sort of improve or to sort of allow for or facilitate cultural unity or European integration. So this is what he's trying to convey via the discussion here. He ends on a funny note as well, saying that certain kinds of shows might be counterintuitive to this entire process. That's a totally different discussion perhaps that the author might have undertaken subsequently. But altogether, this appears to be the gist of the discussion. The author begins via how streaming platforms have proliferated, certain reasons behind this particular phenomenon, how it's fueled by demand of Americans and let's say other entities globally. And then the author is presenting certain constraints and issues, and towards the end he's making his agenda clear that he feels perhaps that these streaming platforms have certain potential in enabling the cultural unity, European integration. That is what he feels here. So I hope this discussion so far is clear and the ideas that have been presented in each of the paragraphs is understood. Let us move on to the questions and try answering them. Question number 1. Based on the information provided in the passage, all of the following are true except, so we have to find something that does not align with the information provided in the passage. Let us examine the choices. A. European television production have the potential to become global hits. This is true based on what has been stated in the passage. We have been given the example of Lupin, and the author definitely feels that such shows can become global hits mainly because of the translation, dubbing and subtitling of such European productions. So in a way, A is true based on the information provided to us, so we can eliminate A. B. Netflix has been able to transform itself into a truly European entity. If anything, the author is saying the very opposite of this. He says that Netflix, the kind of content that Netflix turns out might not truly align with the local preferences in terms of what it's being presented, and this is primarily because of the way in which the top brass makes decisions. So the author says that they are sitting in America and then they are making decisions about what the European audiences might find appealing. So that might not truly work. So in a way, the author says that Netflix is yet to transform itself into a truly European entity. This is what the author is trying to convey. So option B is something that is not true based on the information. This is likely to be the correct choice. Let us examine options C and D as well. Only half of Netflix original programming in the EU is now produced in America. So this is true. The author says that in 2015, it was roughly 75% of the content that was American. Now it has become half. So in a way, option C aligns with this piece of information, although it might be a bit awkwardly phrased, but option C is still valid based on the information or statistics that is being provided in the passage. D. National broadcasters dominate in the EU in terms of total television viewing hours. We know this is the case. The author says that even in well-established markets, streaming platforms such as Netflix or Disney Plus, they sort of possess just 1/3 of the total viewing hours. So the remaining 2/3 is still under the national broadcasters. So in a way, they are definitely dominating the EU market. So option D is also true based on the information provided to us. We notice that option B here is the correct answer because it's not valid based on the discussion that we have observed so far. Let us move on to the next question. Question number 2. The author sees the rise of Netflix in Europe as a unifying force, as filling an entertainment gap, as a looming cultural threat, and economic threat. So the opinions here in D and C are definitely not presented. This idea of Netflix being a cultural threat is something that we could ascribe to, let's say, the European politicians. This is not necessarily what the author himself is presenting. If anything, he feels that the rise of Netflix allows for European integration. It in a way helps bring people together within Europe itself, because if anything, if Europeans want to help each other out, they might be having certain points of differences, and one of the common points could be the kind of shows that they are watching. This is what the author is presenting. So in a way, he feels that Netflix could be a unifying force rather than a threat in any format. Filling an entertainment gap, we are not being presented with any entertainment gap in the passage. So B is off topic. Of the given choices, it's very easy for us to eliminate options B, C, and D and figure out that option A is the correct answer here. It correctly presents the author's position on this topic. Question number 3. Based on the information provided in the passage, which one of the following hypothetical Netflix shows would be most successful with the audiences across EU? So we have been given very limited information with regard to preferences. Let's examine the given choices and identify the correct one. A. An Italian comedy show hosted by an international star. If anything, we are told that comedy as a genre might not work well, because perhaps there are certain nuances or contextual elements that people might not figure out. So comedy in general struggles according to the author. So any such comedy show might not work well. We can eliminate A based on the information given to us. An original German TV science fiction production. Again, this is something that the author states in the passage might not work well. He says that German production in general is not something that people might find palatable. So he says this via the words of an executive, but again, nevertheless, that conveys the kind of preferences that people have in EU. So option B is also something that might not work well. So we can do this via the process of elimination. What would work well based on the information, what would not work well. So we notice that A and B again go against what has been presented as, let's say, that the EU audiences might find appealing. C, a murder mystery drama set in North Africa and France. So mystery is popular. It's definitely a popular genre. Furthermore, it talks about the conflict, some kind of conflict here that's taking place in two different parts of the world. So option C is something that the audiences might find appealing, because we're told that mystery genre is something that definitely fares well. D, a transatlantic romantic drama set in Europe and America. This might or might not work well. We cannot definitively say, because there is not much mention of this particular genre, romance. The only pieces of information provided to us are about these three here. So among the given choices, option C is our best bet here. Let us move on to the next question. Question 4. Which one of the following research findings would weaken the author's conclusion in the final paragraph? Let's inspect the choices here. A. Research shows there is a wide variance in the popularity and viewing of Netflix shows across different EU countries. If true, this would to some extent undermine the idea of cultural unity that the author emphasizes in the last paragraph. He does say how perhaps having common shows to watch, common preferences in terms of the shows that we can watch might benefit us, especially if we expect to interact and cooperate with each other. This is what he conveys in the last part of the discussion in the context of EU. So if there is a wide variance in the kind of popularity, if people have varying preferences in terms of the kinds of show that they watch, then this idea of having similar shows to watch, similar genres that people prefer to watch, this would definitely be undermined, because people would be watching different kinds of shows. So it's not necessarily that they will have similar interest in terms of, let's say, shows. So this is what the author is trying to say. He says that watching similar shows might help us. Option A is counteracting this point, saying that people have different interests, so they might not watch similar shows. So option A to some extent does weaken what the author is trying to present in the final paragraph, especially in terms of the kind of genres that might appeal to people, the kind of topics that might appeal to people. Let us examine the other choices as well, see whether they are relevant or not. B, research shows that Netflix has been gradually losing market share in other streaming television service providers. Does this weaken what the author is presenting in the final paragraphs? Definitely not. It's not relevant at all, mainly because it talks about Netflix market share, which is something that would have been relevant in the earlier parts of the discussion. But again, does it necessarily weaken what is being presented in the passage? No. So option B can be eliminated. C, research shows that Netflix hits produced in France are very popular with North American audiences. Again, this is not relevant to the discussion in the last paragraph, so we can eliminate option C easily. We notice that both B and C are not at all relevant to the final paragraph, so it's very easy for us to eliminate these choices. D, research shows that older women across EU enjoy watching romantic comedies on Netflix, whereas younger women prefer historical fiction dramas. Now, this difference in preferences again does not in any way weaken what is being discussed in the last paragraph. The only option among the given ones that appears relevant in the context of the last paragraph is option A. So option A here is the correct answer.
Google search Cracku free cat mock. Click on the first link. You can attempt a free mock test which was attempted by 30,000 cat aspirants in the actual exam format. After completing the test, you get detailed solutions, analysis and percentile along with your scorecard to gauge your All India performance. Click on the solution to get video solutions from our expert faculty.
Hello and welcome to another video by Cracku. A passage has been given below. Let us read it carefully and answer the questions that follow. The Secondhand September campaign, led by Oxfam, seeks to encourage shopping at local organizations and charities as alternatives to fast fashion brands such as Primark and Boohoo in the name of saving our planet. As innocent as mindless scrolling through the online shops may seem, such consumers are unintentionally or perhaps even knowingly contributing to an industry that uses more energy than aviation. So in the first paragraph, the author talks about this particular phenomenon of second-hand shopping. He specifies that there are certain campaigns, in this case one led by Oxfam, wherein they are encouraging individuals to shop from local organizations or charities. So as the name suggests, it is basically imploring people to buy second-hand clothes potentially, and this is as an alternative to fast fashion brands. So the author cites two fast fashion brands here, and the objective here is to encourage people to have some kind of sustainable clothing options. More specifically, the campaigns are intended to save our planet. So that is the mission or the objective here. What the author is trying to convey is that this fast fashion system that exists currently is something that is causing some form of detriment to the environment. So it's not sustainable at all. And this comparison here is being presented. So the author says that these fast fashion brands, they might be sort of fueling a system which is consuming more energy, which is using more energy than the aviation sector, which is usually known to be or usually condemned to be a very environmentally unsustainable sector. So altogether, the indication here is that there is a particular trend that exists wherein people are being asked to sort of ditch these fast fashion brands and shop locally and choose second-hand clothing options. And the objective here is to find an environmentally sustainable option, which the current industry, the fashion industry, is not. So this is the idea that is conveyed here in the first paragraph. Let us move on to the next part of the discussion. Brits buy more garments than any other country in Europe. So it comes as no shock that many of those clothes end up in UK landfills each year. 300,000 tons of them to be exact. This waste of clothing is destructive to our planet, releasing greenhouse gases as clothes are burnt as well as bleeding toxins and dyes into surrounding soil and water. As ecologist Chelsea Rockman bluntly put it, the mismanagement of our waste have even come back to haunt us on our dinner plate. So here, there is more information being provided to showcase how our existing consumer tendencies are unsustainable. So here in the earlier part, in the earlier paragraph, the author says that the entire facet of online shopping might seem harmless, it might seem innocent, but it is definitely not beneficial to the environment. It's causing some form of negative impact to the environment. So that's one of the points that is highlighted here. And we have been given more information here to back up that claim. So we are told that we have this tendency to shop, and this kind of fast fashion trend that exists right now is definitely not sustainable, mainly because a large chunk of the clothes that we shop end up in landfills. So that's one point that the author wants us to pay attention to. Furthermore, the kind of issues associated with these landfills are also presented. So we burn these clothes and that releases greenhouse gases, which is again not good for the environment. Similarly, the toxins and dyes from these clothes that end up in landfill is another big issue. So the author brings these problems to our notice, and in this regard is trying to showcase how our existing consumption of, let's say, these clothes is not sustainable at all. It's not environmental friendly in any way. Here they are citing, the author is citing the ecologist Chelsea Rockman as well, in a way to showcase that perhaps the kind of these leached elements or the kind of components from these clothes might also end up in our own food. So perhaps it might find its way into, let's say, some of the underground crops that we consume. So that's one possibility. Or it might find its way into, let's say, rivers, into the fish that we consume. So that's one of the ideas that is subtly implied here. Altogether, the agenda is to showcase how the existing system is not environmental friendly, how it's not sustainable. So that's the point the author wants to drive home. Let us read the next part of the discussion to see what else the author presents here. It's not surprising then that people are scrambling for a solution, the most common of which is second-hand shopping. Retailers selling consigned clothing are currently expanding at a rapid rate. If everyone bought just one used item in a year, it would save 449 million pounds of waste, equivalent to the weight of 1 million polar bears. Thrifting has increasingly become a trendy practice. London is home to many second-hand, or more commonly coined vintage, shops across the city from Bayswater to Brixton. So here the author says that given the kind of environmental issues we observe here, second-hand shopping has picked up as a trend. So that's one of the ideas the author highlights here in this particular paragraph. So at the very beginning, he talks about this second-hand campaign, second-hand November campaign. And now he's trying to say that, okay, given that we have observed these kind of environmental issues, people are becoming more and more conscious. And perhaps in a way, they are trying to use this idea of second-hand shopping as a way to counteract the kind of pollution we have observed. So the author also gives us certain statistics in this regard, saying that if even one person is buying one used item a year, it would save 449 million pounds of waste. So that's a very huge figure, a substantial figure. And just to give us a perspective, the author says that it's equivalent to the weight of 1 million polar bears. So just to give us an idea of the scale and how a small action could have a considerable impact. That is the objective here. And this trend has been labeled as thrifting, wherein people are buying second-hand clothes, second-hand objects. And the author also gives us insight or a peek into how this particular trend is picking up, especially in London, in UK. The author says that there are many these kind of thrift stores or second-hand shops that are cropping up in the city. Altogether, the idea here is to say that, okay, given so and so environmental problems, people are now looking towards this particular trend. So the trend that is being that is under focus here is second-hand shopping. So this is how the author is presenting the discussion so far. Let us read further. So you are cool and you care about the planet. You have killed two birds with one stone. But do people simply purchase a second-hand item, flash it on Instagram with #vintage, and call it a day without considering whether what they are doing is actually effective? So here the author is presenting another line of thinking perhaps. It's not clear as to what this idea is, But an open-ended question is often an indication that there is another line of thought that the author wants to introduce. Here, the author says that this idea around thrift stores, this second-hand shopping, is definitely something that could be considered beneficial. It's beneficial for the planet. It makes you look cool as well, according to him. So it's basically two birds in one stone. Altogether, the author is then saying that do people generally tend to buy these second-hand clothes, just flash the show it on social media platforms, and then do not actually use it, or do not actually mull over whether or not it's causing some kind of impact, whether it's beneficial for the environment, or so on and so forth. So basically, the author is saying that do people give much thought into the kind of purchases that they are making, even if it is second-hand? So this is the question the author is posing. This definitely has some significance. Let us read the next part of the discussion to see what the author intends to convey here. According to a study commissioned by Patagonia, for instance, older clothes shed more microfibers. These can end up in our rivers and seas after just one wash due to the worn material, thus contributing to microfiber pollution. To break it down, the amount of microfibers released by laundering 100,000 fleece jackets is equivalent to as many as 11,900 plastic grocery bags, and up to 40% of that ends up in our oceans. So where does this leave second-hand consumers? They would be well advised to buy high-quality items that shed less and last longer, as this combats both microfiber pollution and excess garments ending up in landfills. So a very critical point that the author is presenting here. Earlier on, he asked whether or not people tend to think about whether or not the kind of actions that they are taking, especially even in the context of second-hand shopping, is having some kind of environmental impact. And here the author is actually presenting the kind of environmental impact, even if it's second-hand shopping. So firstly, second-hand shopping was presented as an alternative to the fast fashion industry, the kind of system wherein we are purchasing clothes at, let's say, a tremendous pace, and then these clothes eventually end up in landfills. So as an alternative to that, we were told of second-hand shopping and how this entire trend of thrifting is picking up. But the author says that even this second-hand shopping trend also has some kind of environmental impact, and that is then now being presented. So most of the people who buy these second-hand clothes, they are perhaps unaware of the microfiber pollution that's taking place, and the author is giving us insight into that very same aspect here. He says that these older clothes shed more microfibers, and this is definitely not something that is desirable, according to the author at least. He says that this is contributing immensely to microfiber pollution, and the scale of such pollution is then being presented here. That, for example, if you are laundering, if you are washing 100,000 fleece jackets. By fleece jackets, the author is in a way trying to talk about second-hand clothes. He's trying to say that it's equivalent to the pollution caused by, let's say, approximately 12,000 plastic bags. And this is the scale of impact that these second-hand clothes have as well. The alternative to this, according to the author, it would be best if the kind of second-hand clothes that you are buying is of good quality, it's of high quality. And this would cause less microfibers to be shed, and these clothes will definitely be more durable. So perhaps they might not end up in landfills as quickly as, let's say, other category of worn second-hand clothes, or let's say the kind of clothes that usually end up in landfills. So in a way, this is the alternative that the author is suggesting. He's saying that even if you go forward with thrifting, make sure that the clothes that you're buying is of high quality, because it will contribute less to the microfiber pollution, which is definitely a big issue, according to the author, given the kind of information he is provided with regard to the scale of such pollution. So altogether, the chain of thought so far is that the author says that thrifting or second-hand shopping is picking up as a trend, mainly because of the kind of environmental issues we observe in the current fashion industry, because of fast fashion stores, online shopping, and the pace at which people are perhaps buying clothes, and these clothes end up in landfills. So second-hand shopping is definitely beneficial, but there are certain issues, limitations associated with this second-hand market as well. And what is that issue? The issue is with regard to microfiber pollution. So the author is presenting an alternative. He is presenting a recommendation telling people that it's important that the kind of second-hand clothes you are buying is of high quality. If it's of high quality, these clothes will shed less microfibers, these will last longer, and the kind of environmental impact that we will be observing is perhaps much reduced. This is the idea the author is trying to convey here. Let's read further. Luxury brands would rather not circulate their latest season stock around the globe to be sold at cheaper price. which is why companies like ThredUp, a US fashion resale marketplace, have not yet caught on in the UK. There will always be a market for consignment, but there is also a whole generation of people who have been taught that only buying new products is the norm. Second-hand luxury goods are not in their psyche. Ben Whittaker, director at liquidation firm B Stock, told Prospect that unless recycling becomes cost-effective and filters into mass production, with the right technology to partner it, high-end retailers would rather put brand before sustainability. So the author is giving us another insight into the market constraints that exist, especially in the context of this second-hand shopping trend that we are observing. Firstly, the author mentions that luxury brands are not very keen on circulating, let's say, used products. So the refurbishing market or the resale market, it has not picked up quite yet. They would perhaps in a way perceive this as being substandard or not up to the kind of expectations that they have as brands. That could be one possible reasoning behind why they're not keen about, let's say, selling their products at a cheaper price or reselling their products at a cheaper price. And in a way, the author says that this trend, this idea of resale has definitely been something that has existed in the US market, but we have not seen a similar kind of demand or development in the UK. This is what the author is conveying here via this comparison or this example of ThredUp here. He also says that there is this kind of rationale or ideology or perspective that exists as well, that the generation itself has been taught to buy new products. So buying used products or second-hand products is not something in our psyche. So the author says that we have been hardwired in such a way that we might not think of buying used goods. So that's another issue the author notes here. The author also says that the entire affair of recycling goods is not cost effective enough as of yet. So it's not financially attractive to these brands. So as long as that's the case, as long as it's not viable or financially attractive to these brands, they are going to focus more on, let's say, improving their brand presence, or they'll not put much emphasis on whether or not their goods or their products are going to be environmentally sustainable. So sustainability will always take the backseat as long as this affair of recycling and reselling goods is not financially attractive. That's the idea the author is trying to convey towards the end of the passage. So three important points with regard to the constraints associated with the second-hand market is being presented here in the final paragraph. So I hope the discussion so far is clear. Now that we've understood what this passage is about, let's examine the questions and try answering them. Question number 1. The central idea of the passage would be undermined if. So we have to find a statement or an option that would actually weaken the central idea of the passage. So what is the passage about? Essentially, it's trying to talk about the environmental impact, firstly, of the existing fashion industry, fast fashion industry. Then the author talks about how second-hand shopping is picking up, primarily because we are able to reduce the extent of waste, or at least that's what people tend to believe, that we are able to reduce waste through second-hand shopping. But the author also talks about certain challenges and considerations within the second-hand market. He says that firstly, the kind of products that we buy also impacts the kind of environmental impact that exists. So we have to buy high quality products that will last longer and will shed less microfibers. So that's one important consideration. Secondly, the kind of psychological ideas with regard to purchases is an important constraint. Secondly, the kind of perspective or viewpoints that these luxury brands have also needs to be factored in. So these are the different set of points that the author discusses with regard to the central idea. So it's basically about all these taken together, wherein the author is trying to say that we need to purchase high quality items, or at least that is something at the center of the discussion, when he says that we need to purchase high quality items in order to sort of mitigate the impact of the existing fashion industry, fast fashion industry. And he's trying to say that there are a range of factors that we need to consider in this regard. That's the kind of message the author is trying to present via the discussion. Let's see which of the options, if true, would actually go against this particular thought. A, customers bought all their clothes online. So if true, it doesn't as such weaken any of the points mentioned in the passage. The author himself is saying that right now we continue to shop online, which is why he's saying that we need to consider second-hand shopping as well, and more specifically, we need to buy high quality second-hand goods that will shed less microfibers and that will that will last longer. So it will as such have reduced environmental impact. That's the point the author is presenting. So A is not undermining that point. If anything, it aligns with the information the author presents in the very first paragraph, that we are focusing on online shopping. So the mode of shopping is being discussed here in A, which as such is not undermining the central idea. B, clothes were not thrown and burnt in landfills. If true, this would perhaps, let's say, go against some of the points mentioned, but as such, it's not weakening what the author is trying to convey. So if anything, it would say that, okay, it's not as such aligned with the discussion of second-hand clothing. So it's unclear how B would attack the central idea heavily, or it would undermine what the author is trying to say heavily. More specifically, the author's prescription is with regard to the kind of second-hand clothes you should buy, and that appears to be at the center of the passage, because that's the recommendation the author himself is presenting. So option B as such is not relevant to that particular recommendation. So we can put B on hold. In the absence of a better choice, perhaps we can select B, because it is presenting a sort of opposing information presented in the passage. C, second-hand stores sold only high quality clothes. If this is true, then it would weaken the author's recommendation. Why is that the case? Because the author is making that recommendation that second-hand stores do not sell high quality clothes, which is why the kind of products we buy shed more microfibers. That's the kind of thinking that he undertakes here. When he says that we should buy high quality clothes, he's already assuming that currently second-hand stores do not offer high quality clothes, which is why he then transitions into a discussion on luxury brands and sort of resale of these luxury brands or high quality luxury goods. So that's the kind of rationale he has here. So if it is already proven that second-hand stores sell only high quality clothes, then it's going to undermine the recommendation the author is presenting in the passage. So it would definitely undermine the central idea of the discussion. So C here is the best option so far among the given ones that we have seen. So C is likely to be the correct choice. Let's examine D as well. Primark and Boohoo recycled their clothes for vintage stores. Even if this is true, this is a very specific instance. So it's an example that even if true, would not necessarily undermine the recommendation that is being presented in the passage. So we observe that only option C is something that attacks what the author has stated in the passage, because it's basically refuting one of the assumptions that is necessary for the recommendation he's providing. So option C here is the correct choice. Let's move on to the next question. Question number 2. According to the author, companies like ThredUp have not caught on in the UK for all of the following reasons except that. Let's examine the choices. A, recycling is currently not financially attractive for luxury brands. This is something that the author mentions, that these brands might prefer to focus on their brand visibility or the brand value rather than, let's say, sustainability, because recycling at this point in time might not be a financially viable or attractive affair for them. So A is in line with what is being presented in the passage. B, luxury brands want to maintain their brand image. This also is to some extent logical inference that we can derive from the discussion that we have observed, that they might not be very keen on reselling their products at a cheaper price. So the author does mention this at the beginning of the last paragraph. So B is also to some extent in line with what is being presented here in the passage. He says that there is this particular kind of perception around resale and second-hand goods that exists, at least in the UK, which is why companies like ThredUp have not sort of developed or caught up here in the UK market, UK second-hand market. That's the idea the author is conveying here. C, luxury brands do not like their product to be devalued. This to some extent might be considered an extension of what is being stated in B, that they don't want to sell their their goods at cheaper value, primarily because they feel that it might be devaluing their brand. So although it's a bit of an exaggeration, you could say that it aligns with the idea in B. We'll put option C on hold. In the absence of, let's say, a better choice, we'll go with option C. D, the British don't buy second-hand clothing. So I can definitively say that D is incorrect, because we know that thrifting is already picking up in the UK. The author talks about the sort of the kind of numerous thrift stores that or second-hand stores that have come up in London, and the author in general says that this entire idea of thrifting is definitely picking up pace in the UK. So option D, I can say, is definitively incorrect, while option C is something that we can say aligns with option B, and we cannot definitively comment whether or not C is incorrect or not. I can say that C aligns with what is being discussed here with regard to B and A. So C is also something that we could say is correct. So A, B and C are correct, while D is something that we can say is not mentioned here as a reason. So D here is the correct choice. Let's move on to the next question, question number 3. Based on the passage, we can infer that the opposite of fast fashion, slow fashion, would most likely refer to clothes that, let's examine the choices. A, are of high quality and long lasting. B, do not bleed toxins and dyes. C, are sold by genuine vintage stores. D, do not shed microfibers. So for one, we can say that A is the most comprehensive option we have here. Fast fashion, the author says that slow fashion, it's not explicitly stated here, but we know what fast fashion is in the sense that the author says that it's not desirable. And then he goes forward and gives us a recommendation of how we should focus on buying second-hand high quality clothes which last longer and shed less microfibers. So in a way, we could say that slow fashion is all about sustainability, especially causing less waste or causing lower impact on environment. And in this regard, option A would be the best choice among the given ones. This idea around bleeding toxins and dyes is very specific. It's true, it would be part of, let's say, the second-hand clothes that we would expect to buy, but again, it's not what the author would what we could say is the best choice here. Same with option D, not shedding microfibers is also a part of what the author talks about here in A. So we could say that both B and D are in a way a subset of option A. So we can reject these two choices. This focus on genuine vintage stores is not something that we can understand based on discussion. This is not something that the author is very worried about. So of the given choices, by the process of elimination, we can see that A is the best among the given choices, and it aptly presents what the author would tag as, let's say, slow fashion in the context of the discussion. Let's move on to the next question, question number 4. The act of thrifting as described in the passage can be considered ironic because A, has created environmental problems. B, it is not cost effective for retailers. C, it offers luxury clothing at cut rate prices. D, it is an anti-consumerist attitude. So right off the bat, I can eliminate options A and B because they are totally irrelevant. They don't align with any of the points that is mentioned in the passage. The author doesn't talk about any anti-consumerist attitude. He doesn't talk about it not being cost effective for the retailers, or at least it is not what the author is worried about in the passage at all. He finds it ironic mainly because the primary agenda of thrifting is to be environmentally sustainable. So people buy second-hand clothes mainly because they feel that they are causing less detriment to the environment. So that is the objective here. But then the author points out that when people buy second-hand clothes which are of low quality, they are in fact contributing to microfiber pollution. So the author says that this is why it's ironic. People think they are not causing any kind of environmental issues, but they are in fact contributing to certain environmental issues. So this is why he feels it's ironic. It's mainly because thrifting or the second-hand market itself has certain environmental constraints or problems associated with it. So there are certain environmental problems associated with thrifting, which is why the author is calling it ironic, because the objective of thrifting is to have or to not create any environmental problems. So option A here is the correct choice. The author is again not worried about luxury clothing or offering luxury clothing at cut rate prices. This is not why he calls it ironic. So of the given choices, I can see that option A here is the evident answer, and hence we can mark it as the correct choice. Thank you. Hello and welcome to another video by Cracku. A passage has been given below. Let us read it carefully and answer the questions that follow. Over the past 4 centuries, liberalism has been so successful, it has driven all its opponents off the battlefield. Now it is disintegrating, destroyed by a mix of hubris and internal contradictions. According to Patrick Denine, a professor of politics at the University of Notre Dame, equality of opportunity has produced a new meritocratic aristocracy that has all the aloofness of the old aristocracy, with none of its sense of noblesse oblige. Democracy has degenerated into a theatre of the absurd, and technological advances are reducing ever more areas of work into meaningless drudgery. The gap between liberalism's claim about itself and the lived reality of the citizenry is now so wide that the lie can no longer be accepted, Mr. Denine writes. What better proof of this than the vision of 1,000 private planes whisking their occupants to Davos to discuss the question of creating a shared future in a fragmented world? There are a set of critical ideas that is being presented here. On the surface, it looks like the author is trying to talk about Mr. Denine's opinion on liberalism or its decline. So the author says that over the past 4 centuries, so for the past 400 years, liberalism has definitely dominated the political battlefield. And what he means by this is that it has been a prominent ideology. So just let's recap what liberalism is. Liberalism is this political belief or idea that individual liberties of freedom must be kept at the forefront, and how these liberties might be at threat by the government or by other entities. Regardless, what liberalism in a very simple term means is that individual freedom is important. There are certain rights and freedoms that every individual must have. So that focus on individual expression is at the center of liberalism. There are certain other ideas as well, but in the context of the passage, just to understand what it is about, let us just say that liberalism is a political ideology that focuses on individual liberty. And the author says that this particular political ideology has dominated the political realm for quite some time. It has been very successful. It has been something that we could consider in the context of today's democracy, because today's democracy is often used interchangeably with liberal democracy. And the author says that liberalism at this point in time is now in a decline. Rather than the author's opinion, the author is saying that this is what Mr. Patrick Denine, who is a professor of politics at the University of Notre Dame, is presenting. So Patrick Denine states that liberalism is now facing a decline, and this is primarily due to a mix of hubris and internal contradictions. So there are certain underlying contradictions or certain mismatches in the ideas that are existent today, which Mr. Denine holds responsible for the disintegration or for the decline of liberalism. So this is one of the first ideas the author emphasizes here. Certain associated problems, such as how the equality of opportunity has created a meritocratic elite, is also presented here, wherein what the author is trying to say here is that given the outcomes of liberalism, we now see meritocratic aristocracy, and the author is comparing this with the old aristocracy, so perhaps in the previous centuries, and he says that they are quite similar in some sense but different in other. So this sense of noblesse oblige, so what this means is basically how certain privileges entail responsibility. So that is the meaning of this particular term here. So what the author is trying to convey via this line here is that we have a group of people, a group of elite today, who have the set of privileges that the old aristocracy had, who are just as aloof as the old aristocracy. So perhaps they are not very well aware of the problems, social problems that exist in the society, or rather they choose to ignore these social problems. But at least the old aristocracy had a sense of responsibility. They felt that, okay, with their privileges came certain social responsibility, certain responsibility to change or reform the people around them and the situation and circumstances around them. So the author says that this ideal of noblesse oblige is no longer existing in the new meritocratic aristocracy according to him. So in simple words, the author is presenting this as a problem, and he says that you can link this to the decline of liberalism. That is the idea the author presents here. He also states that the democracy has degenerated into a theater of the absurd. So in a way, he's saying that you can feel that certain political processes or democratic values are also being undermined, and this is also something that the author links to the disintegration of liberalism. So these are two components so far. The author also presents another societal issue here, which is basically how technological developments have created problems within our society, how people are now pushed into meaningless drudgery. So the author says that perhaps a large section of the people or the society are now doing meaningless work. And this is primarily a result of technological advances. So per se, perhaps technological advances might not be a problem, but we notice that it has had certain detrimental impact as well. So this is what the author is trying to convey here. So far, we notice that perhaps rather than the author, this is the idea that is being linked with liberalism by Mr. Denine. And we also note that Mr. Denine says that the gap between liberalism's claim about itself and the lived reality of citizenry is quite wide. So basically, he's saying that there are certain promises that entail liberalism, the ideal of liberalism, And the reality, the ground reality, is quite different from these promises, is what Mr. Denine believes. And he says that this gap between the promises versus reality has become so wide that it's now perhaps unfillable. So this might be the idea he might be implying here. Altogether, we notice that the author in the first paragraph is concerned with Mr. Denine's perspective, especially on the decline of liberalism. He firstly says that because of certain internal contradictions, liberalism in a state of decline or in a state of decay, and despite dominating the political realm for quite some time. And now the author is saying that, okay, so and so things can be observed in the society, which we can then link to the decline of liberalism. So he's giving this example of the creation of a meritocratic elite who are not very concerned about social changes. He also talks about how democratic processes and values might be undermined, and how this is also reflective of the decline of liberalism, and how technological advances have also impacted certain societal aspects. Subsequently, he says that Mr. Denine specifically believes how there is this mismatch between the promises or the ideals or values of liberalism and the reality of citizens. So he's saying that this is good enough for us to see that liberalism is definitely disintegrating. It's in a state of decay. Finally, here in the last part of the first paragraph, there is this example of certain elite. So here we are told of individuals who are traveling in their private planes to Davos. So Davos is a place in Switzerland, and the author, what he's trying to convey here is this gap that he mentioned earlier on. So he states that there is this mismatch in what's actually happening and what liberalism actually promises. So here there is an example of a group of individuals who are traveling in private planes, which indicates that they are definitely well off. These are people who perhaps are super rich, and they are traveling to Davos perhaps for some kind of political meet, for some kind of, let's say, discussion on creating a shared future in a fragmented world. And this is quite ironic. Why is that the case? Because these are individuals who are quite privileged. They can be considered to be, let's say, the top 1% of the society. They're traveling in private planes. So we can definitely believe that they are in the top 1% of the society. And they are having a discussion on how to create a shared future. By shared future, perhaps it means that they want to share their future with the less privileged masses. And this is what we could infer from, let's say, a fragmented world here. And altogether, what the author is trying to convey here is that there is definitely this mismatch. So on one side, we have these category of people who are privileged. On the other hand, they are trying to say that, okay, we will create this shared future. But again, the intention here is to showcase this stark contrast, that these are the very same individuals who are traveling on private jets to places and then trying to promise this particular future to the world at large. And in this way, it showcases kind of the double standards that people might have. And this might be something that we can equate to the meritocratic aristocracy that the author had mentioned earlier on. So altogether, our objective is just to simplify and state that in this first paragraph, the author is presenting Mr. Denine's argument that liberalism, despite its historical success, is now failing due to certain internal contradictions. And the author is basically focusing on certain consequences of this decline, or rather certain aspects of this particular decline here in the first paragraph. Let's read further. Denine does an impressive job of capturing the current mood of disillusionment, echoing left-wing complaints about rampant commercialism, right-wing complaints about narcissistic and bullying students, and general worries about atomization and selfishness. But when he concludes that all this adds up to a failure of liberalism, is his argument convincing? He argues that the essence of liberalism lies in freeing individuals from constraints. In fact, liberalism contains a wide range of intellectual traditions which provide different answers to the question of how to trade off the relative claims of rights and responsibilities, individual expression, and social ties. Liberals experimented with a range of ideas from devolving power from the center to creating national education systems. So another pertinent point being presented by the author here, more specifically, he's focusing on Mr. Denine's interpretation of this decline of liberalism. So the author says that Mr. Denine writes something. So he, in a way, is trying to say that this might be part of an essay or a book that Mr. Denine had written. And he says that he agrees with certain aspects of this particular written work. He says that Mr. Denine does a good job at capturing certain elements of this discussion around the failure of liberalism. But when he says that these set of factors that is being discussed here, for example, capturing this mood of disillusionment here, then the left-wing complaints, the right-wing complaints, and the general varies. So all these different components, the author says he's capturing this correctly, but when he's saying that all these components are responsible for the failure of liberalism, is his argument convincing? So in a way, the author is posing this open-ended question, but his agenda is to showcase that perhaps he doesn't necessarily agree with Mr. Denine's argument or Denine's position that liberalism is failing, liberalism is dying. Perhaps this is what the author is trying to convey here. So he says that he agrees with XYZ stuff, he does not agree with other set of stuff. So this is what he's trying to present here. And the author is also saying that, okay, Mr. Denine focuses on individual freedom or individual expression. That is at the center of his definition of liberalism. This is what the author states. But the author says that this is not necessarily true. When Mr. Denine emphasizes individual freedom too much, he might not be correct and he might be very narrow in scope. So this is what the author conveys, primarily because he states that liberalism as an idea is pretty broad. He says that people have over centuries tried to figure out a good balance, or they have experimented with different kinds of answers, different kinds of mixes when it comes to, let's say, individual freedom, individual expression, responsibilities that are entailing as a result, the impact on society. So in a way, the author is trying to say that liberalism encompasses more set of ideas than Mr. Denine lets it in his work. This is the point that the author is trying to make here. And this might be one point of disagreement between Mr. Denine and author. So the author in a way is conveying his agreement with certain aspects of Mr. Denine's work and his disagreement with other set of aspects. So this is the gist of the second paragraph. I hope this part is clear here. What the author is trying to say is that he doesn't necessarily agree with Mr. Denine when he says that some set of factors are contributing to the failure of liberalism, and he also doesn't agree with Mr. Denine's specific definition of liberalism as being purely focused on individual freedom. The author says that liberalism has a broader usage, it has a broader set of ideas that it entails. This is the point he is making here. Let's read further. Mr. Denine's fixation on the essence of liberalism leads to the second big problem of his book, his failure to recognize liberalism's ability to reform itself and address its internal problems. The late 19th century saw America suffering from many of the problems that are reappearing today, including the creation of a business aristocracy, the rise of vast companies, the corruption of politics, and the sense that society was dividing into winners and losers. But a wide variety of reformers working within the liberal tradition tackled these problems head-on. Theodore Roosevelt took on the trusts, progressive cleaned up government corruption, university reformers modernized academic syllabuses and built ladders of opportunity. Rather than dying, liberalism reformed itself. So here the author presents another point of disagreement. Earlier on, he said that Mr. Denine is focusing too much on one specific aspect of liberalism, which is individual freedom or the constraints associated with individual freedom. The author says that from this particular focus arises another big problem according to him. So he says that there is another issue he has with Mr. Denine's book, which is that when he says that liberalism is dying, he fails to capture the self-reforming or self-correcting ability or capacity of liberalism itself as an idea. So this is one of the points he specifies here. He says that his failure to recognize liberalism's ability to reform itself and address its internal problems. So in a way, Mr. Denine does not factor in this particular aspect, and the author gives us a set of points in this regard. He says that the problems that we observe today, that we associated with liberalism, was something that also appeared in the 19th century as well. So in the late 19th century, some set of problems that America saw are reappearing even today. But then there were certain reformers who made certain corrections in the trajectory that the society took, and they were able to make changes, make amends, and liberalism was able to perhaps reform itself. And in this regard, the author says that you cannot necessarily say that liberalism is dying or liberalism is failing, because it is too soon. There is quite a possibility that we might be able to make amends, we might be able to make changes and reform liberalism as it is right now. So this is the point the author is trying to make. He's saying that Mr. Denine is saying that liberalism is failing, but I don't agree with that. I feel that there is still a capacity for us to reform and make amends. This is the point the author is trying to convey to us as readers. So firstly, in the earlier paragraph, he talks about one point of disagreement. Here we come across another core critique of Mr. Denine's fixation that the author presents with regard to the failure of liberalism. The author says that liberalism is not necessarily dying. There is still room for some form of reformation or some kind of self-correction that we can undertake. And in this regard, the author is trying to say that you can just look at this historical reformative capacity of liberalism in order to see that Mr. Denine might not be correct. So this is the idea he's trying to present here. A set of examples here, these are not of too much significance to us, but the author does state some set of problems which might be relevant. He talks about this creation of business aristocracy. So this is quite similar to the individuals that he mentioned in the first paragraph perhaps, who went to Davos in their private jets, and they were trying to have this discussion on creating a shared future, ironically. So that could be the business aristocracy that might be referred to here. The rise of vast companies, again, something along the lines of concentration of wealth potentially. Then the corruption of politics. So again, some degradation of political processes. This also aligns with the author saying that democracy is in a way failing as well in the first paragraph. The sense of society dividing into winners and losers. Altogether, these are certain problems that the author states we observed in the late 19th century. And here the author says that these are the actions that were taken and people were able to make amends. So for example, Roosevelt was able to take on trusts that were created. So some historical anecdote around this might help us. But nevertheless, it's beyond the scope of the discussion. The intention here is to just showcase that certain amends or reforms were undertaken that helped us deal with these problems. So the author says that it's too soon for us to say that we will not be able to deal with the problems that we see today. So you cannot say that liberalism per se is failing. There is still room for amends, and this is what the author is trying to convey as a point, and this is his position on the topic. Let's read further. Mr. Denine is right to point out that the record of liberalism in recent years has been dismal. He is also right to assert that the world has much to learn from the pre-modern notions of liberty as self-mastery and self-denial. The biggest enemy of liberalism is not so much the atomization but old-fashioned greed, as members of the Davos elite pile their plates even higher with perks and share options. But he is wrong to argue that the only way for people to liberate themselves from the contradictions of liberalism is liberation from liberalism itself. The best way to read why liberalism failed is not as a funeral oration, but as a call to action, up your game or else. So here, another important set of points. The author is simply reiterating his points of agreement and disagreement with Mr. Denine. So firstly, the author says that he agrees with some set of ideas that have been discussed in Mr. Denine's work. So we gain more clarity on what this passage is about when the author talks about this particular work here, Why Liberalism Failed. So this appears to be the book written by Mr. Denine, and this entire passage that we read was a review of that particular book by the author. So he says that in this book, I agree with so and so points that Mr. Denine has presented. I disagree with this particular argument that Mr. Denine has stated in his book. So this is how the author is trying to undertake this discussion. So in this first part, he says that he agrees when Mr. Denine points out that liberalism is declining, it's disintegrating. That's definitely true given the situation. But he doesn't agree with the aspect that this is the end of liberalism. He feels that there is still room for some kind of reformation, some kind of actions that can be taken to make changes. And the author says that we just need to look at the historical demonstrations or examples wherein liberalism was able to reform itself and to sort of become new concept altogether perhaps. So in a way, the author is trying to say that there is still room for amends, and in a way he says that we can read this book not as a funeral oration. It's not as if liberalism is dying or liberalism is dead, but rather that there is room for actions. There is some kind of amends that need to be made, some kind of reforms that need to be undertaken in order for liberalism to stay. So in a way, that is the idea the author is presenting, and he says that he doesn't agree with Mr. Denine on this particular point. The author again mentions the Davos elite, so the same reference in the first paragraph, just to showcase how rather than certain aspects of liberalism being threatened by old-fashioned greed. So in a way, he's saying that what is actually threatening liberalism is greed, and he gives the example of this Davos elite. He says that these are individuals, these are super rich individuals who are, let's say, talking about a shared future, but are trying to benefit and profit themselves. So the author says that they are piling their plates. By piling their plates, the author is saying that they are sort of stuffing more money into their pockets with perks and share options. So this is what he's trying to convey here. In a way, again, to reiterate the idea that what is actually threatening liberalism is not necessarily atomization or other set of problems that might be presented, but old-fashioned greed. And in a way, he's trying to, again, call out the double standards or two-facedness of these individuals, as he did in the first paragraph. So I hope the discussion so far is clear. A lot of complicated ideas being presented here, but any person who has, let's say, read about liberalism should be able to go forward with this particular RC. So far, we notice that the author begins by citing Mr. Denine's position of how liberalism is failing, then he states that, okay, so and so ideas have been presented by Mr. Denine. I agree with, let's say, points A and B, but I disagree with the point C that Mr. Denine has presented. This is how he's undertaking this critique here in this passage. So I hope that chain of thought is clear enough. Let's move on to the questions and try answering them. Question number 1. The author of the passage refers to the Davos elite to illustrate his views on. So we notice that this has been the case. This reference has been made in two parts of the discussion, in the first paragraph, in the last paragraph. So what the author is trying to say here is that these are individuals who are quite privileged, who are undertaking a discussion on helping out, let's say, their less privileged counterparts, but at the same time they are trying to increase their profits, increase their share of wealth in the society. So in a way, the author is saying that their very actions are counterintuitive to the actions that they're calling out. So the intention here is to showcase this double standards that these individuals possess, and it is in this regard that the author had earlier mentioned the meritocratic aristocracy. Perhaps he's trying to say that these individuals don't have a sense of responsibility that we would have seen in the, let's say, earlier aristocracy. So this is the point he had made earlier on as well. Perhaps he might be referencing to the Davos elite here in this regard. So altogether, the intention is to showcase the two-faced nature of this particular category of individuals. Let's check which of the options would align with this understanding of ours. A. The unlikelihood of a return to the liberalism of the past as long as the rich continue to benefit from the decline in liberal values. This is not necessarily the purpose of this particular example. The author doesn't say that we won't be able to return to the liberalism of the past. If anything, he's simply trying to say that these individuals have quite a contradictory behavior. They're showcasing two different agendas here. So this is what the author is trying to do, not necessarily saying that we won't be able to reform ourselves or we won't be able to change liberalism and bring back the old ideals. That is not the intention here. So option A can be rejected. B. The way the debate around liberalism has been captured by the rich who have managed to insulate themselves from the economic hardships. So the agenda is not to showcase how this particular category of individuals, let's say, view the debate on liberalism. That is not the intention here. The author is not concerned with their perspective. The author is simply stating a fact. He's saying that these are individuals, or Mr. Denine is simply stating that these are individuals who fly in their private planes to a particular city, and then they complain that, okay, we need to figure out a way to create a shared future. And then at the same time, they're also stuffing their pockets with more profits and more money. So in a way, the author is calling them out. He's not saying that, okay, their perspective on so and so issue is this. That is not the agenda here. So saying that the intention is to capture the way in which they perceive the debate would be incorrect. We can eliminate option B. C. The hypocrisy of the liberal rich who profess to subscribe to liberal values while cornering most of the wealth. This is exactly what he's trying to do. In a way, he does say that these are individuals who are subscribing to liberal values. How is that the case? They want to create a shared future. So that is in a way aligning with some of the ideals of liberalism, at least, to create a liberal society. But at the same time, they are cornering most of the wealth. So this is also a point the author mentions at the end of the passage. So in a way, his agenda is in fact to emphasize the double standards of this particular category of individuals. So option C is likely to be the correct choice. D. The fact that the rise in liberalism has led to a greater interest in shared futures from unlikely social classes. Again, the author doesn't say that these guys are genuinely interested in a shared future. That is not his point here. And it's not as if to say that, okay, these are individuals who are concerned about a shared future. That is definitely not the kind of positive representation we observe in the passage. So option D is also out of the picture. We noticed that we could have eliminated options A, B and D easily and figured out that the agenda here was to showcase how these individuals have certain double standards. So if you had understood what the passage was about, this would have been perhaps a relatively easier question to mark based on elimination. So option C here is the correct answer. Let's move on to the next part of the discussion. All of the following statements are evidence of the decline of liberalism today except. So we have to find a particular option that would not qualify as an evidence of the decline of liberalism today. A bit tricky question because all of these statements have been cited in the passage or presented in the passage. Let's examine them. A. And technological advances are reducing ever more areas of work into meaningless drudgery. So for one, the author does mention this in the first paragraph, but we need to think a bit deeper and figure out whether or not this is linked with the decline of liberalism. So the author presents this as the situation that exists today. He is saying that, okay, this is a problem that we observe, but liberalism per se is promising us with a set of outcomes. Is technological advancement undermining this particular promise, or is it part of that particular promise, is difficult for us to figure out. And as such, the author is not saying that technological advances is bad. He's just saying that one of the outcomes of this is the kind of meaningless drudgery that a large chunk of the population might have to undertake. So he's just presenting this as the situation in the society, and it is not necessarily linked with liberalism or the promises or issues with liberalism. So option A we can put on hold, primarily because we cannot necessarily say that it's the evidence of the decline of liberalism. So option A can be put on hold. Let's examine the other choices. B, the creation of a business aristocracy, the rise of vast companies. This is one of the problems that the author mentions, I believe, in the penultimate paragraph, wherein he talks about the problems associated with liberalism that we observed in the late 19th century in America. So this is in fact an evidence of the decline of liberalism, because the author states that, okay, these traits were something, or these characteristics were something that we also observed in the previous century, and in the previous century when we could say liberalism was also on a decline, but then reformers made some changes. So option B has been stated in the passage as an evidence, so we can say that B is definitely an evidence. C, democracy has degenerated into a threat theater of the absurd. A bit tricky, primarily because it's quite similar to A. Why is that the case? It could be a very broad statement that the author is trying to present about, let's say, the current status quo of the society. That could be the case. But if you notice in this paragraph, in the penultimate paragraph, the author also talks about how the politics has become corrupted. And this is not necessarily about the corruption in general. What he's trying to say is that political processes have degraded. They have become worse. And in this way, he could have been trying to say that democratic values are also being undermined. So we can link this idea of corruption of politics to democracy having degenerated. So in a way, C is also linked to this decline of liberalism. So we can say that, okay, it qualifies as an evidence. So C is also valid. We cannot say the same for A, because it's not being presented anywhere in the passage except for the first paragraph. So A and C, while they appear similar, we can say that C is definitely linked with one of the issues that the author discusses subsequently. So C is also an evidence of the decline of liberalism. What about D? The gap between liberalism's claim about itself and the lived reality of citizenry now is so wide that the lie can no longer be accepted. Now, this is also something that the author mentions, or Mr. Denine mentions here in the passage, when he says that you should look at this particular aspect to infer how liberalism is in a state of decay. So this is definitely one of the points that we could state as an evidence of the decline of liberalism. So we notice that B, C and D, we could have figured out that B and D are definitely valid based on what is being discussed in the passage. Between A and C, there is definitely a confusion, because both of these have been presented in the first paragraph in a general sense, in a broader manner. So how do we figure out which one of these is correct? We could say that this discussion around democracy is something that the author reiterates in the penultimate paragraph, and he talks about the corruption of politics and how the society divided into this system of winners and losers. So we could say that in a way it might be related to that particular point, while option A is not something that we can definitively say is attached to liberalism or the promises of that we see in liberalism. So option A here is the correct answer. Let's move on to the next question. Question number 3. The author of the passage is likely to disagree with all of the following statements except. So given the double negatives, we can simply state what the question requires us is to find a statement that the author will agree with. So let's examine the given choices. A, claims about liberalism's disintegration are exaggerated and misunderstand its core features. This is not something that the author will necessarily agree with, mainly because he says that liberalism is definitely disintegrating. It's in a state of decline. It's not exaggerated. So the author agrees with this position that Mr. Denine presents. He says that this disillusionment and this dismal state has been correctly presented by Mr. Denine. So the author is bound to disagree, or he won't agree with this particular statement here in A, which is why we can reject it. B, if we accept that liberalism is a dying ideal, we must work to find a viable substitute. So for beginners, the author is definitely not going to agree that liberalism is a dying ideal, because he says that there is a capacity to reform. If you look at history, you'll see that liberalism has an ability to autocorrect or self-correct. And this is what we might also observe in the, perhaps let's say, in the near future. This is the point the author is trying to convey. He doesn't believe that liberalism is dying or dead. And in this regard, he might also not agree with that we can find a viable substitute. So that idea itself is not something that we can definitively comment on. So B is also something that we can say the author will disagree with. C, liberalism was the dominant ideal in the past century, but it had to reform itself to remain so. This is something that the author presents explicitly. He states that one point that Mr. Denine misses out on is the ability or the capacity of liberalism to reform itself. And he says that perhaps we could say that in a way the author will agree that liberalism has stayed dominant mainly because it was able to reform itself and become a new ideal in a way. So option C aligns with the point that the author himself presents in the passage, so he'll agree with it. D, the essence of liberalism lies in greater individual self-expression and freedoms. So the author says that liberalism has a wider range of ideas rather than, let's say, this emphasis on self-expression. So it's not just, he in a way agrees that the essence of liberalism can be, let's say, focused to this particular idea. So he says that there is more set of ideas and there have been varied interpretations on how we balance of, let's say, individual freedom, self-expression, the responsibilities that entail, so certain societal ties. All of these ideas have had, let's say, been given emphasis in varying degree in varied interpretation. So this is what he's trying to say when he talks about liberalism, and he says that you cannot say that the essence of liberalism boils down to this particular trait. So he disagrees with that. So option D is also out of the window. So we notice that of the given choices, option C has been presented by the author himself when he says that there is this capacity that liberalism has to reform itself, and we need to definitely pay heed to that. So option C here is the correct answer. Let's move on to the next question. Question number 4. The author of the passage faults Denine's conclusion for all of the following reasons except. So we have to find a point, a reason that the author has not used to actually criticize Denine's views. Let's examine the choices. A, it's repeated harking back to pre-modern notions of liberty. If anything, we are told that Denine doesn't pay much heed to the pre-modern notion of liberty, or rather, the author says that he might touch upon this particular idea, but he fails to look at certain historical aspects, such as the historical ability of liberalism to reform itself, to correct itself. That's something that Mr. Denine has not focused on, according to the author. So this is not presented as a criticism of Mr. Denine's work. So we can say that option A is likely to be the correct choice. B, its failure to note historical instances in which the process of declining liberalism has managed to reverse itself. This is something that the author states. He says that this is the second problem of Mr. Denine's work or his book. So option B is true. It's one of the points that the author is using to attack Mr. Denine's conclusions. So option B is valid. C, its extreme pessimism about the future of liberalism today and predictions of an ultimate decline. This is also something that the author comments on. He says that it's not necessary that liberalism will die. That's not the case. He feels that if anything, we should consider it as a call to action. There is room for amends, there is room for changes and reforms via which we can perhaps revive liberalism. That is the position that the author takes here. So in a way, he is critical about the extreme pessimism that Mr. Denine showcases. So option C is also valid. D, its very narrow definition of liberalism limited to individual freedoms. This is also one of the problems the author mentions. He presents problem number 1 as this narrow focus on liberalism, this narrow definition of liberalism being limited to individual freedom. That's the problem number 1 he presents. Second is this aspect of how Mr. Denine misses out on this ability or capacity of liberalism to reform itself. So he mentions these two criticisms very clearly in the passage. So we can say that B, C and D can be are valid criticisms, while option A is not something that the author uses to actually fault or to actually criticize Mr. Denine's conclusion. So option A here is the correct answer.
Google search Cracku CAT formulas PDF. Click on the first link. You will get a list of topics for CAT. Click on one of the topics. Download the PDF to get a list of formulas for the topic.
Hi friends, welcome to Cracku's video series. In this particular para-insertion question, the sentence that is given to us is, dualism was long held as the defining feature of developing countries in contrast to developed countries where frontier technologies and high productivity were assumed to prevail. But let us take a look at the paragraph. At the core of development economics lies the idea of productive dualism, that poor countries' economies are split between the narrow modern sector that uses advanced technologies and larger traditional sector characterized by very low productivity. While this distinction between developing and developed and advanced economies may have made sense in the 1950s and 1960s, it no longer appears to be very relevant. A combination of forces have produced a widening gap between the winners and those left behind. Convergence between rich and poor parts of the economy was arrested and regional disparities widened. As a result, policymakers in advanced economies are now grappling with the same questions that have long preoccupied developing economies, mainly how to close the gap with the more advanced parts of the economy. So earlier, what was the case? So what is productive dualism? Productive dualism is that your economy is split into two parts. There is this modern part of your technology, so basically like the tech driven part, which is a small sector, okay, and then there is the traditional economy, so consider like your smaller businessmen, agriculture, etc. This modern part is rich, it is growing rapidly, it is the part of the economy which is doing well, and the traditional part which is poor, which struggles, which has low productivity. This was usually the disparity that was seen. The developing countries had this kind of model of economy which was split into two parts, and developed countries did not have it. So developed countries had more or less an economy which was neither like split into traditional and modern, and this kind of dualism was absent in developed economies earlier. But what has happened now? Now this kind of dualism is even seen in the developed economies. So this productive dualism is no longer a distinction factor between developed and developing economies, because it is seen everywhere now. So what is the point? That this dualism was long the defining feature of developing countries. Defining feature means how do you identify whether a country is a developed country or a developing country? A developed country would not have dualism, a developing country would have dualism. Now the situation has changed, even developed countries are having that. So there are regional disparities, there is a widening income gap. So this dualism is seen everywhere, so it's no longer a defining feature. This is part of the past. And if you take a look at the sentences, while this distinction between was may have made sense in the 50s, this starts with the shift to now. So what is the case now? It no longer appears to remain relevant, because now, because of a combination of forces, the widening gap between the winners and those left behind. So now even in modern economies, even in developed economies, you are seeing this shift. Those who are rich are becoming richer, those who are poor have become poorer. So the convergence between rich and poor and rich parts of the economy was arrested. Arrested means it was stopped, and regional disparities widened. As a result, policymakers in advanced economies are now grappling with the same questions that have long preoccupied developing economies, mainly how to close the gap between the more advanced parts of the economy. So now the developed politicians are also, developed countries politicians are also thinking that how do I reduce the income gap? Earlier thinking about how income inequality was affecting. Income inequality, all of these ideas were ideas in the developing countries. Now these ideas have become actually mainstream in developed countries, because the idea of productive dualism is there now even in developed countries as such. So this part entirely is the situation now. This was the earlier part, the earlier situation. And if you see the given sentence is also what was there earlier. So that means a given sentence should either be in one or two. Dualism is basically mentioned over here. The dualism is that is mentioned over here is the defining feature. But before you say that dualism was the defining feature, you have to essentially mention it. You have to tell what is dualism, which is essentially done in this particular sentence. So this given sentence, which is a missing sentence, should come after this sentence. So the only place in which you can actually place this given sentence is blank 2. First you define what is productive dualism, and then say why it was a defining feature of the developing countries, because it was what separated developing countries from developed countries. Now that is no longer the case. So the only place where this sentence fits is option 2. Hi friends, welcome to Cracku's video series. In this para-insertion question, we have been given the following sentence, and probably much earlier, moving the documentation for kissing back 1000 years compared to what was acknowledged in the scientific community. So the paragraph itself is, so the sentence is talking about how the time in which kissing started has been moved by 1000 years backward. The date at which we recognize kissing started has been pushed back by 1000 years. So let us take a look at the paragraph. Research has hypothesized that the earliest evidence of human lip kissing originated in a very specific geographical location in South Asia 3500 years ago. From there, it may have spread to other regions, simultaneously accelerating the spread of herpes simplex virus 1. So from there is referring to the area in South Asia. So the sentence cannot fit over here, because this is talking about time, and this there over here, this pronoun there requires this location. So this sentence, if it puts in, you put in 1, the pronoun antecedent flow is broken, so it cannot be put in 1. According to Troels Pank Arbol and Sophie Land Rasmussen, who in a new article in the journal Science draw on a range of written sources from the earliest Mesopotamian societies. Kissing was already a well-established practice 4,500 years ago in the Middle East. Now, 4,500 years ago, 3,500 years ago, the difference is 1,000 years, which means that this idea, the new article research is essentially pushing back the date from 3,500 to 4,500. So, it is pushing back the date from by 1,000 years. So, this sentence is essentially giving the conclusion of this new discovery made by these people in the research paper. So, this given sentence does fit in option 2. It tells you what is the significance of what they have discovered. The significance is that it pushes back the date from when we had the first documentation of kissing from 3,500 back by 1,000 years to 4,500. In ancient Mesopotamia, people wrote in cuneiform scripts on clay tablets. Many thousand of these clay tablets. So again, these clay tablets refer to these clay tablets. Again, it does not fit over here because it will break the flow. These clay tablets, that pronoun requires the object mentioned in the earlier sentence. So this sentence would actually break that flow. So 3 is also gone. Have survived to their day, and they contain clear examples that kissing was considered part of romantic intimacy in ancient times. Kissing could have been part of friendships and family members' relationships, says Trolls Pank Arbol, an expert of the history of medicine in Mesopotamia. So again, 4 is giving you an example or essentially elaborating on the part that is mentioned over here. So again, this sentence which talks about how the date was shifted by 1,000 years does not fit in 4. It only fits in 2, which basically tells you that okay, now the date is shifted from 3,500 BC to 4,500 BC as such. Oh, so 4,500 years ago, not BC or this. 3,500 years ago to 4,500 years ago. That 1,000 year shift is mentioned over here. So the given sentence fits in option 2, which is option D. Hi friends, in this particular OOC Para-Jumble question, we are given the following sentences. The banning of northern lights could be considered a precursor to censoring books for moral worldview or religious reasons. Attempts to ban books are attempts to silence authors who have summoned immense courage in telling their stories. Now, the banning and challenging of books in the US has escalated to an unprecedented level. The widely acclaimed fantasy novel Northern Lights was banned in some parts of the US and was the second most challenged book in the US. The American Library Association documented an unparalleled number of reported book challenges in 2022, about 2,500 unique titles. So over here, let us see which sentences are essentially connected to each other. So if you see 4 introduces the novel Fantasy Lights and it tells you that it was the second most challenged book in the US. The banning of the Northern Lights could be considered a precursor to other things as such. So 4 and 1 are related and it should be in that particular order. So firstly, you say that it is the second most banned challenge of book in the US and the banning of it was a precursor of censoring book for moral or worldview or religious reasons. So this was essentially at some point of time this book was banned and it was a precursor of things to come. And what things came? Now you have a huge culture of banning books. So 4.1 tells you that it was a precursor of the things to come about how much people started banning books. Now you are told there's another link of sentences. There is now the banning and challenging of books has escalated to an unprecedented level. And 5 tells you the level. There are 2,500 unique titles that are essentially banned. So 3.5 tell you the current situation. So this was the precursor to the current situation which is given in the 3.5 sentences as such. So essentially 3.5 is the current situation, 4.1 is the older situation. So 4.1, 3.5 together make a coherent paragraph. If you take a look at 2, it gives you the reasons why people are banning books. So it's an attempt to silence authors and who have summoned immense courage. But this is the reason why books are banned and has nothing to do with the 4.1.3.5, which essentially tells you what was one of the starts of the book banning phase and what heights it has reached at this point of time. So 4.1.3.5 together tell you about the craze for banning books, how widespread it has become, and 2 tells you the reason. So the reason for banning books is a different topic entirely. 4.1.3.5 is only about how it has a problem out of hand as such. So 2 is telling you about the reasons for that. So that is a separate paragraph entirely. So 2 is the odd one out. 4.1.3.5 together forms a coherent paragraph which tells you that this book banning mania has just gotten out of hand. It started with that, with Northern Lights, which was one of the precursors of what is going to happen. And now look at it, we have now reached 2,500 titles which have been banned. So 4.1.3.5 is a coherent paragraph, 2 is the odd one out. Hi friends, welcome to Cracku's video series. In this particular OC Para-Jumble question, we have the following 5 sentences given. Self-care particularly links to loneliness, behavioral problems and negative academic outcomes. Latchkey children refers to children who routinely return home from school to empty homes and take care of themselves for extended periods of time. Although self-care generally points to negative outcomes, it is important to consider that the bulk of research has yet to track long-term consequences. In research and practice, the phrase children in self-care has come to replace latchkey in an effort to more accurately reflect the nature of their circumstances. Although parents might believe that self-care would be beneficial for development, recent research has found quite the opposite. So if you take a look at 5, okay, 5 tells you that people might think that it is good, but it has had, the recent research shows that self-care actually has negative outcomes. Where are these negative outcomes mentioned? In 1. 1 tells you that self-care particularly links to loneliness, behavioral problems and negative academic outcomes. So 5-1 forms a pair which shows that self-care among children might be thought to be actually good for the child, that they will get independent earlier, but it is actually bad for them, and then the negative outcomes are listed. So 5-1 is a pair definitely. Now if you take a look at 2, the whole topic of children who are taking care of themselves, or first were called latchkey children, now children in health self-care, is essentially introduced in 2. Who they are, what exactly defines latchkey children is given in 2. Now 4 essentially corrects that by saying that in practice now the name has been changed from latchkey children to children in self-care to represent what it is actually the case. It's not that they are, latchkey essentially means that they open the latch with their own key. The children who come home from school and open the own door, and they have their own keys and there's nobody at home when they come. So that's why they were called latchkey children. But that is not a correct way of describing them. They are essentially children who are taking care of themselves, and because of that, the term has now been changed to children in self-care. So 2, 4 are also related, which essentially describe the children and tell how they are named as such. Now if you take a look at 2, 4 and 5-1, 2, 4 describes who the children are. 5-1 talks about the negative impact of self-care or children in self-care as such. So 2, 4, 5-1 together forms a coherent paragraph which introduces us to children in self-care and gives us the negatives of putting children in self-care. So 2, 4, 5-1 forms a coherent paragraph. 3, if you see, 3 tells you that okay, that the self-care points to negative outcomes, but we have yet to track the long-term effects as such. Now this has nothing to do with the remaining points that are being made. Now you can essentially say that okay, after 5 you can say that okay, the things points are like there are no negative, people believe that there are only negative outcomes, but we do not know the long-term trend. Now if you are actually going on that track after 2, 4, if you are actually going on that track, you have to give at least some positive or neutral outcome of that. But there is nothing else which has a positive or neutral outcome. 5 tells there are negative outcomes, 1 gives you what the negative outcomes are. So 3, really there is nothing to continue with 3. So because there is no precursor nor successor to 3, 2, 4, 3 cannot be the case. The order should be 2, 4, 5, 1 and 3 would be the odd one out.
Hello and welcome to another video by Cracku. The 4 sentences given below, when properly sequenced, would yield a coherent paragraph. We need to decide on the proper sequencing of the order of sentences and key in the sequence of the 4 numbers as our answer. Let us go through the given statements. 1. Like the ants that make up a colony, no single neuron holds complex information like self-awareness, hope or pride. 2. Although the human brain is not yet understood enough to identify the mechanism by which emergence functions, most neurobiologists agree that complex interconnections among the parts give rise to qualities that belong only to the whole. 3. Nonetheless, the sum of all neurons in the nervous system generate complex human emotions like fear and joy, none of which can be attributed to a single neuron. 4. Human consciousness is often called an emergent property of the human brain. So at the very beginning, I noticed that 4 is a very broad statement, a very general statement, which usually serves as the introductory statement here. What about the others? There is also a link that I noticed here between 1 and 3. Why is that the case? So here there is discussion on no single neuron. And here the author presents a contrast by saying the sum of all neurons. So in a way, he's trying to present these two contrasting ideas together. He says that no single neuron holds complex information. It doesn't, let's say, encode self-awareness, hope, or pride, but together they can present, or they contain this complex human emotion or complex information together. This is what he's trying to present. So in a way, he's trying to say how all the neurons together are necessary for consciousness. They represent something that we cannot attribute to a single neuron. So in a way, 1 and 3 are definitely linked, mainly because the author is presenting this contrast of, let's say, one entity versus all entities taken together. So 1, 3 is definitely a pair here. What about 4? We can place 4 at the very beginning. It's a very broad statement, a blanket comment here. Statement 2 here is basically re-emphasizing what is being highlighted here in 3. We are being presented more information. We are told that we don't have a mechanism as such at this point in time to understand how human brain functions, but this is something that most neurobiologists agree, that the point stated in 3, how all neurons taken together, the complex interconnection between these neurons is responsible for certain qualities that we possess as individuals. So 2 is basically reinforcing the idea that is presented in 3. So I can place 2 after 3. So I can first create this link between 1 and 3. I notice that 4 is a broad statement, so maybe it can serve as a conclusion, or maybe in most cases, in this case at least, it would serve as an introduction. So 4, 1, 3 is a logical block, and this can be followed up with 2, which is basically reinforcing what is being stated in 3. So 4, 1, 3, 2 is the correct answer to this particular question. I hope this is clear. Thank you. Hello and welcome to another video by Cracku. The 4 sentences given below, when properly sequenced, would yield a coherent paragraph. We need to decide on the proper sequencing of the order of sentences and key in the correct answer. Let's read the given set of statements. 1. Contemporary African writing, like the bottled leopard, voices this theme using 2 children and 2 backgrounds to juxtapose 2 varying cultures. 2. Chukwumeka Ike explores the conflict and casts Western traditions as condescending, enveloping, and unaccommodating towards local African practice. 3. However, their views contradict the reality, for a rich and sustaining local African cultural ethos exists for all who care to see and experience. 4. Western Christian concepts tend to deny or feign ignorance about the existence of a genuine and enduring indigenous African tradition. So from the very onset, I noticed that 4 would be a good introduction, primarily because the author is presenting an assertion. He states something, and I noticed that the remaining sentences are linked with this. Firstly, this point here, contemporary African writing. So an example is being cited here and voices this theme. So this has to be related to some particular theme that the author is discussing early on. And in this regard, 4 is a point that that is presenting sort of attitude that exists, a kind of theme that might be relevant to the discussion altogether. So 4 would definitely be a good introduction. It's an independent statement, while the remaining ones are dependent on some other points. So for example, here 3 says that their views. So their here has to refer to something. Similarly, the author mentions here Ike here, so some particular person who is presenting something. And in this regard, we can note that 1 and 2 might be linked, because here the author talks about one example, and this particular person might be the author of this particular work here, and trying to put forward a message or to drive home a message. So 1, 2 might be linked somehow. What about 4? So in 4, the idea that the author is trying to convey is that Western Christian concepts, they tend to deny or feign ignorance. So in a way, the author says that Western Christian concepts are critical of the indigenous African traditions. So this is the gist of what the author is conveying here in 4. But 3 here says that this is not necessarily the case, and he says the author is trying to criticize and tell us that their views, so their views here in this regard is talking about Western Christian concepts. The author says that their views contradict reality. So he says that this is not actually the case. There is a genuine and enduring indigenous African tradition, but for people who actually care, people who actually want to see and experience it. So it's not as if it is this criticism is relevant or valid in any manner. So the author is trying to state that he or she does not agree with this particular setup or this particular belief system, wherein they say that okay, there is no genuine or relevant or enduring indigenous African tradition. So the author is trying to use 4 and 3 together here to put forward an idea, saying that there is definitely a cultural ethos, an African cultural ethos for people to see and to experience. So it's not as if the Western Christian concepts that is actually feigning ignorance is correct. It's not something that the author agrees with. He's criticizing the Western Christian concept. The example here in one is actually supplementing this idea, saying that this particular book is voicing the theme that we observed here. It is trying to present how perhaps this kind of condescension that we observe here, how Christian concepts are being condescending of African traditions, and how there might be actually some kind of valuable African cultural ethos that people can view. So in a way, the author is giving this example to say that you can look at this, or you can turn to this particular book to see this particular theme or this particular idea that I mentioned in 4 and 3 play out. This is how the author is presenting this discussion. And the example of author Ike here is just trying to show that this is what he's doing in this book. This is the attempt that he's making to make certain corrections or to present certain ideas with regard to the kind of points we observed in 4 and 3, the kind of condescension or this conflict that exists between Western Christian concepts and African tradition. So the author here is using 1 and 2 to elaborate, or as an example, to present the ideas mentioned here in statements 4 and 3. So 4, 3, 1, 2 here forms a logical block, and hence is the correct answer to this particular question.
Hi friends, in this particular para-summary question, we are given the following paragraph. People spontaneously create counterfactual alternatives to reality when they think of if only or what if, and imagine how the past could have been different. The mind computes counterfactuals for many reasons. Counterfactuals explain the past and prepare for the future. They implicate various relations, including causal ones, and they affect intentions and decisions. They modulate emotions such as regret and relief. They support moral judgments such as blame. The ability to create counterfactuals develops throughout childhood and contributes to reasoning about other people's beliefs, including their false beliefs. So there are 3 main points that I can see. People spontaneously create counterfactuals, and what are counterfactuals is given. Spontaneously create counterfactuals. So what are counterfactuals? That if only this had happened, there is reality, and then there is this imaginary thing that you hope would be reality. So if only I had called this person, or if only we had met, or if only XYZ. So this is reality, and counterfactual is essentially alternate reality almost. So what is counterfactual is given, and how people spontaneously create counterfactuals is given, the first one. Then the reasons for creating counterfactuals is given. There are multiple reasons given. The mind computes this for many reasons. One is that it explains the past and prepares for the future. They implicate various relations, including causal ones. So why something happened, the causality of it can be understood by creating this counterfactual. You understand that this was the key point. Because of this happened. If that had not happened, this would not be the reality. And they affect intentions and decisions. So this affects how you take decisions. This affects what you intend to do, because you know exactly what led to what kind of scenario. So essentially, these counterfactuals help you reason as to what is the chain of events, what is the stimulus for the next event as such. So that helps you take prepare your intentions, prepare your decisions, because you know what is the cause-effect relationship as such. They modulate emotions such as regret and relief. So basically, it helps you overcome whenever you're feeling regret. It is basically from this, that okay, if only I had done this, or relief is basically that what if I had done this, then I would have been in a better position. So all of these are related to your emotions also. So this is also one of the reasons why you actually generate counterfactuals. So all of this is essentially reasons for generating counterfactuals. The ability to create counterfactuals develops throughout childhood and contributes to reasoning about other people's beliefs, including their false beliefs. So the reasons for counterfactuals is given. The ability is developed through childhood, and it helps you in doing other inferences as such. So this ability also helps in understanding other people's intentions as such. So 3 essential points are there that you spontaneously develop it. What are the reasons for that? And the ability develops through childhood, and it essentially helps you, also enables you to do other things like understand other people's intentions. So now that we understand what are the main points, let's take a look at the options. Counterfactuals help people to prepare for the future by understanding intentions and making decisions. So these 2 are reasons. This is not exclusively the reason that prepare for the future. It helps you understand the past. It helps you prepare for the future. It helps you understand intentions and make decisions. It helps you modulate emotions like regret and all. So this kind of focuses only on one of the points and is like very myopic in its view. So A can be eliminated. People create counterfactual alternatives to reality for various reasons, including reasoning about other people's beliefs. So this is true. This part is the second reason. But it is not, including reasoning about people's belief is not one of the reason. Reasoning about people's beliefs is an ability which is conferred by counterfactuals. So if you are able to create counterfactuals, you get the ability to reason about other people's beliefs. It is not one of the contributing reasons why counterfactuals are created. So there's a distortion here, so I can eliminate option B. Counterfactual alternatives to reality are created for a variety of reasons and is part of one's developmental process. So if you look at C, it ticks both 2 and 3 as such. The only part is that the spontaneity is not mentioned, but essentially these are alternatives to reality is mentioned. So essentially explaining what are counterfactuals, and they are created for various reasons, giving point 2, and they are part of developmental process. So it develops through your childhood and it helps you understand other people's intentions and beliefs and false beliefs also. So this is a correct summary of all 3 points. So I'd say that C would be the correct answer. But let's take a look at option D also. Counterfactual thinking helps to reverse past and future actions. How can it reverse past actions? Can your alternative reality thinking help you reverse past? Nothing can reverse the past, right? And reason out false beliefs. Again, it does not help you reason out false beliefs. It helps you understand what are other people's beliefs, including false beliefs as such. So this is completely distorted. Very easy to eliminate option D. C is the right answer. Hi friends, welcome to Cracku's video series. In this particular video, we have the following paragraph. Heat waves are becoming longer, frequent and intense due to climate change. The impacts of extreme heat are unevenly experienced with older people and young children, those with pre-existing medical conditions and on low incomes significantly more vulnerable. Adaptation to heat waves is a significant public policy concern. Research conducted among at-risk people in the UK reveals that even vulnerable people do not perceive themselves as at risk of extreme heat. Therefore, early warnings of extreme heat events do not perform as intended. This suggests that understanding how extreme heat is narrated is very important. The news media plays a central role in this process and can help warn people about the potential danger as well as about the impacts on infrastructure and society. So I can basically cut this paragraph into 2 parts. 2 points are being made. The first point is that heat waves are dangerous and many people are very vulnerable to heat waves as such. Some very vulnerable and to heat waves. Basically, they can, it's a big danger for a small or for a subset of people, it is a big danger as such. So heat waves are dangerous, some vulnerable, especially vulnerable to it. Okay, this is the part of, this is the point being made by these lines, okay. Now consider the second part, what is being mentioned or what point is being made over here. The point being made over here is that even those who are actually vulnerable to heat waves don't think that they are vulnerable to heat waves. People don't feel that, okay, I can actually die from a heat wave. But it is actually the case. Some people will die of heat waves. And that is basically of how the risk is being perceived. So the author is basically saying that it is extremely important that we convey the risk properly. And then he says that this is where news media comes in. It is the responsibility of us to properly convey the potential danger of heat waves through these news media as such. So the author is essentially saying what is the problem, and he also proposes the solution to the problem, which is properly conveying the dangers of heat waves using news media. So people don't recognize the risk. News media central to correctly conveying the risk. So these are the 2 main points being made in the paragraph. Our correct option should have these 2 points. Protection from heat waves is important, but current reports and public policies seem ineffective. Now here, it's not about current reports and public policies. Protection from heat waves is important, but people are not recognizing the risk. That is the problem. So this part is incorrect. So A can be eliminated. People are vulnerable to heat waves caused due to climate change. Measures taken are ineffective. It's not just that measures taken are ineffective. People are not recognizing the risk, and we need to make them recognize the risk through use of news media. They have given a solution. B is missing that, so B is incorrect. Heat waves pose an enormous risk, correct. The media plays a pivotal role in alerting people to this danger. Both A and B have been covered. I would say C is the right answer. News stories help in warning about heat waves, but they have to become more effective. Now, while this part is correct, it's not about them become effective. It is how they should be utilized properly in raising awareness or making people recognize the danger of heat waves. Moreover, D does not contain the first part, which is about the danger posed by heat waves. That is not there at all. So C is the right answer.
We at Cracku provide all the previous year CAT papers along with many other MBA examinations such as XAT, SNAP, MAT, CMAT, TIS and PGDBA in the actual exam format. You can attempt them as a test and get a detailed analysis of your performance or download them as PDFs.